Tonight, let us settle into a quieter corner of history. Draw the curtains of the day closed. Let the room grow still. This evening, I will be your guide as we begin our slow journey through the history of the Italian Mafia. This is not a story that begins with gunshots or whispered deals in smoke-filled rooms. It begins much earlier, in the soft hills and dry fields of southern Italy, where the land itself seemed older than law, and trust was not something written on paper but something guarded in silence. As I speak, imagine Sicily at dusk. Stone walls holding back olive groves. Dirt roads warming under the last light of the sun. The distant sound of church bells folding gently into the evening air. In these quiet places, far from distant capitals and shifting governments, people learned to rely on each other long before they learned to rely on the state. Here, protection was personal. Justice was informal. Honor was spoken softly and remembered carefully. The word mafia did not arrive fully formed. It drifted into existence through centuries of uncertainty. Foreign rulers came and went. Authority felt distant and unreliable. Farmers, shepherds, and landowners turned inward, building networks of loyalty that promised safety when official systems failed to appear. These early bonds were not criminal in the modern sense. They were practical, human, rooted in survival. Over time, these quiet arrangements hardened into something more structured. Power began to concentrate. Protection became conditional. Silence became a rule rather than a habit. What began as mutual aid slowly learned how to profit from fear. In the villages around Palermo, in the hills near Corleone, and across the wider island of Sicily, families formed codes that would endure longer than many governments. These codes prized loyalty over truth, respect over law, memory over written record. To belong was to be protected. To betray was to vanish from the story entirely. As the centuries moved forward, these networks adapted. They learned how to survive new rulers, new economies, and eventually new continents. They slipped into the spaces between laws, into moments of transition, into times when order felt thin and fragile. They did not rush. They waited. Tonight, we will not hurry either. In this series, I will walk with you through the long evolution of these organizations. We will explore how rural guardians became urban power brokers. How honor became hierarchy. How silence transformed into an enforced tradition known as omerta. We will observe the rise of groups such as Cosa Nostra, not as legends, but as living systems shaped by history, environment, and human choice. This is a story of shadows, yes, but also of ordinary lives shaped by extraordinary structures. It is a story of patience, adaptation, and continuity. And it is best understood slowly. So take a breath. Let the world outside grow faint. As the night deepens, we will begin gently, moving further back in time, to the land itself, and to the conditions that allowed this quiet power to take root. Part 1: The land before the name. Before there was a word for it, before there were symbols or whispered titles, there was only land. I want you to imagine Sicily as it once was, long before newspapers or courtrooms tried to explain it. The island rests quietly in the center of the Mediterranean, a place where sea breezes soften the air and the earth itself seems to remember everything that has passed over it. Mountains rise gently in the interior. Fields stretch outward in uneven patches of green and gold. Stone walls trace boundaries that feel older than memory. In these early centuries, life moved slowly. Dawn arrived without urgency. Work followed the sun. People lived close to the soil, and the soil did not always give generously. Droughts came. Harvests failed. Armies arrived without warning. And just as suddenly, they left. Sicily was ruled by many and protected by few. Empires claimed it in name, but rarely in presence. Authority existed on paper, carried in seals and decrees that traveled slowly across water. In the villages and farms far from the coast, law was distant and abstract. If trouble came, there was no official to call, no uniform to summon from the horizon. So people turned to each other. Protection was not ideological. It was practical. Families formed understandings. Neighbors made promises. Strong men emerged not because they were cruel, but because they were present. Someone had to stand between the land and those who would take it. In these quiet arrangements, power did not announce itself. It settled in gradually, like dust on a windowsill. Large estates dominated much of the countryside. Absentee landlords lived elsewhere, often on the mainland or in cities like Palermo. Their land was worked by tenants and laborers who depended on the harvest for survival. When disputes arose, when theft occurred, when rival claims surfaced, there was no reliable system to resolve them. Courts were slow. Officials were corruptible. Distance diluted authority. Into this space stepped intermediaries. Men who knew the land. Men who knew the people. They collected rents, enforced boundaries, and offered protection. At first, they were useful. Necessary, even. They were called upon to settle disagreements quietly. To retrieve stolen animals. To discourage bandits from lingering too long. They did not speak of power. They spoke of respect. Respect became the currency of survival. Over time, these figures gained influence. Not because they seized it, but because it was handed to them, piece by piece, in moments of fear and uncertainty. A farmer who needed help. A landowner who wanted peace. A village that preferred stability to chaos. Silence became part of the arrangement. Problems were handled privately. Outsiders were kept at a distance. Trust remained internal, guarded carefully within known circles. This was not yet the mafia. There were no grand organizations, no formal hierarchies. There was only a pattern forming, slowly and almost invisibly. The land taught patience. The seasons rewarded those who waited. As centuries passed, Sicily changed hands again and again. Norman rulers. Spanish crowns. Bourbon kings. Each brought new laws, new taxes, new expectations. But few brought consistent protection to the rural interior. Each regime relied on local power brokers to maintain order, often without fully understanding the systems they were reinforcing. In towns like Corleone and countless unnamed villages, these local enforcers became indispensable. They bridged the gap between state authority and everyday life. They translated distant rules into local realities. And in doing so, they learned how much leverage they truly held. Protection was no longer free. A favor required a return favor. A service created an obligation. Gratitude hardened into expectation. What began as mutual aid slowly shifted into control. Still, this control remained subtle. It did not rely on spectacle. It relied on memory, on reputation. on the quiet understanding that consequences existed, even if they were never spoken aloud. This unspoken code would later be known as omerta. But here, in its earliest form, it was simply how one survived. You did not involve outsiders. You did not speak unnecessarily. You handled matters within the circle. To speak openly was not bravery. It was foolishness. As trade expanded and cities grew, these rural systems adapted. Ports brought opportunity. Citrus groves and sulfur mines generated wealth. And where wealth gathered without adequate oversight, so too did those who knew how to manage fear. By the 19th century, these informal networks had become more recognizable. They had names. They had territories. They had traditions passed from one generation to the next. What had once been flexible became rigid. What had once been communal became hierarchical. This is where the roots of Cosa Nostra begin to take shape, though the men living through it would not have recognized the term as we know it today. To them, it was simply our thing. Our way of doing things. Our way of keeping order when no one else could. The Italian state itself would soon unify, bringing new promises of law and structure. But for many in Sicily, these promises felt familiar and hollow. They had heard them before, under different flags and languages. Trust was not easily given to distant capitals. So the old systems remained. They adjusted. They endured. What is important to understand, as we move forward, is that the Mafia did not emerge from chaos alone. It emerged from absence. From the long spaces where authority failed to arrive, and people filled the silence themselves. There is a temptation to see this history in sharp lines of good and evil. But history rarely moves so cleanly. It drifts. It accumulates. It settles. Tonight, as we rest here at the beginning, let the image soften. Picture the fields at dawn. The low voices exchanged near stone walls. The sense that order exists, but not where you expect it to be. In the stillness of this early world, the foundation has been laid. Nothing dramatic has happened yet. No headlines. No legends. Just land. Just people. And a quiet system learning how to survive. As the night continues, we will drift gently into the moment when these invisible structures begin to step forward, becoming something more defined, more powerful, and far harder to escape. Part 2: Honor, Silence, and the Shape of Power. As we move a little further along the path, the air begins to change. The Sicily of this moment still looks quiet on the surface. Fields continue to ripple under the wind. Church bells still mark the hours. Families still gather at dusk, sharing bread, olives, and news spoken carefully. But beneath this familiar rhythm, something is settling into place. Power is learning its own shape. By the early 19th century, the systems we spoke of before have grown more confident. The men who once acted only as intermediaries now understand their importance. They are no longer simply filling a gap left by absent rulers. They are becoming the structure itself. I want you to imagine a village at evening. Lantern light flickers against stone walls. Doors are closed not out of fear, but out of habit. People know who lives where. They know who speaks for whom. There is comfort in this familiarity, and also constraint. Order exists, but it is personal. Disputes are rarely written down. They are remembered. A wrong is not forgotten when the sun sets. It is carried quietly, sometimes for years, until the right moment arrives to address it. Justice moves slowly, but deliberately. In this world, reputation matters more than law. A man's word becomes his currency. To break it is to lose standing. To keep it, even at great cost, is to earn protection. Honor is not a philosophical idea here. It is a practical one. It determines who can be trusted, who can be relied upon, and who will stand alone when trouble comes. This is the soil in which silence takes root. Speaking openly to authorities is seen not just as dangerous, but as deeply disrespectful. It suggests that internal systems are insufficient. It implies weakness. And weakness invites chaos. What we will later call omerta is forming not as a command, but as a shared understanding. You handle matters privately. You protect the group by limiting what leaves it. You do not expose internal affairs to outsiders who neither understand nor care for the community itself. This code is not written. It does not need to be. Children absorb it without instruction. They watch how adults lower their voices. They notice which names are spoken carefully and which are never spoken at all. Silence becomes second nature, passed down as easily as stories and recipes. At the same time, Sicily is changing. The economy begins to expand beyond subsistence farming. Citrus exports grow. Sulfur mines open across the interior. Wealth increases unevenly and unpredictably. Where money flows quickly, so too does competition. And competition requires enforcement. Landowners, many of whom still live far from their estates, rely increasingly on local strongmen to protect their interests. These men collect rents, supervise laborious, and discourage theft. In return, they are given authority, resources, and a degree of independence that quietly elevates them above the communities they once served. What was once mutual dependence begins to tilt. These local figures now have something to lose. Status, income, influence, and so they take steps to preserve it. Alliances are formed between families. Territories are informally defined. Boundaries are respected, not because they are official, but because crossing them has consequences. Violence, when it appears, is controlled. It is not chaotic. It is selective and purposeful. The goal is not spectacle, but message. Most of the time, the message does not need to be delivered at all. Its possibility is enough. Fear becomes background noise. This is not yet the cinematic mafia of later decades. There are no grand titles or formal ceremonies. But there is already a hierarchy forming, understood by those within it and invisible to those outside. In cities like Palermo, urban neighborhoods begin to reflect these same patterns. Dock workers, merchants, and craftsmen fall under informal protection systems. Contracts are enforced without courts. Debts are remembered without paperwork. The state remains present in name, but weak in practice. Officials rotate frequently. Corruption is common. Trust in institutions is thin. Many people find it safer to rely on familiar power than distant authority. This is how parallel systems endure. When Italy moves toward unification later in the century, it promises something new. A centralized government. Uniform laws. National identity. But for many Sicilians, this feels like yet another distant promise. Another ruler replacing the last, speaking a different dialect of power. The old systems do not disappear. They adapt. Men who understand local loyalty become useful to the new state, whether officially or unofficially. Votes are influenced. Order is maintained. Problems are solved quietly. The line between criminality and governance blurs, not because anyone intends it to, but because it has always been thin. In towns such as Corleone, families who have cultivated influence for generations now find themselves uniquely positioned. They know how to organize people. They know how to enforce agreements. They know how to remain indispensable. What emerges from this moment is a clearer identity. The phrase Cosa Nostra, meaning our thing, reflects a deep sense of ownership. This is not merely an organization. It is a worldview. A belief that order must be managed internally by those who understand the land, the people, and the cost of disorder. To outsiders, this world appears opaque and frustrating. Investigations stall. Witnesses remain silent. Communities close ranks. But from within, it feels logical, even necessary. It is important to linger here, in this moment of formation. Nothing feels inevitable yet. These systems could still have dissolved under stronger institutions, fairer governance, or sustained trust in the state. But history does not always offer clean interventions. It offers momentum. And momentum carries these structures forward. As night settles more deeply around us, imagine the quiet confidence of these early power holders. The sense that they are not rebels, but caretakers. That they are preserving stability in an unstable world. Whether this belief is sincere or self-serving depends on who you ask. Often, it is both at once. This is the paradox at the heart of the Mafia's early history. It grows not in opposition to society, but alongside it. It mirrors society's needs, fears, and gaps. As we rest at the close of Part 2, let the scene soften again. The lanterns dim. Voices fade. The systems we have observed do not announce themselves. They simply remain. In the stillness that follows, something enduring has taken shape. Part 3, when the state arrived quietly. As we continue onward, the world begins to stir. The 19th century does not arrive in Sicily with a sudden noise. It does not announce itself with clarity or certainty. Instead, it seeps in slowly, carried by rumors, uniforms seen only occasionally, and promises spoken in unfamiliar accents. This is the era when the modern Italian state begins to form, and with it comes a new idea of authority. But ideas do not replace habits easily. I want you to imagine a village waking just before dawn. The stones are cool beneath bare feet. Smoke rises gently from hearths. Life continues as it always has. Somewhere far away, in places that feel abstract and distant, politicians debate borders, citizenship, and national identity. Here, those discussions feel irrelevant. What matters locally is whether the harvest will hold, whether disputes will remain contained, whether the systems people rely on will still function tomorrow. When Italy unifies in the 1860s, it brings a single flag under which many different regions are gathered. For some, this is hopeful. For others, especially in Sicily, it feels like yet another external power asserting itself without fully understanding the land it claims. The new state promises law. It promises courts, police, taxation, and order. But these promises arrive unevenly. Infrastructure is limited. Officials are often unfamiliar with local customs. Resources are stretched thin. And into this uncertain space, the existing systems remain. The local power networks that have already learned how to manage order do not resist the new state openly. They do something far more effective. They accommodate it. They learn how to work alongside it, beneath it, and sometimes through it. This is where adaptability becomes survival. Men who already command loyalty at the village level become useful intermediaries. They help maintain peace. They influence elections. They discourage unrest. In return, they are often left alone. Sometimes they are quietly relied upon. Sometimes they are deliberately ignored. The boundary between legality and illegality becomes soft. For ordinary people, the experience of authority remains fragmented. A tax collector may arrive demanding payment. A judge may issue a ruling that takes months to enforce. But if something goes missing tonight, if a conflict erupts tomorrow, it is still the familiar local figures who resolve it quickly. Trust continues to flow inward. Silence deepens. Speaking to the state does not feel safer than speaking before. In some cases, it feels riskier. The state is new, untested, and distant. The local power is known, predictable, present. This is the environment in which the mafia solidifies its modern character. What was once informal now begins to formalize internally, even if it remains invisible externally. Rules are clarified. Membership becomes more exclusive. Loyalty is tested more carefully. The idea of belonging transforms from convenience into identity. A man is no longer simply helpful or respected. He is affiliated. In places like Palermo, this process accelerates. Urban density creates opportunity. Construction contracts, dock labor, transportation routes, and markets all require coordination. Where coordination exists without oversight, enforcement follows. Disputes between groups become more complex. Negotiation becomes necessary. Violence, while still controlled, becomes more organized. Messages are sent not only within villages, but between them. A quiet network begins to stretch across the island. In towns such as Corleone, family-based power becomes particularly enduring. Influence is inherited as much as earned. Children grow up understanding not only who they are, but what they represent. Names carry weight. History is remembered selectively. The concept of Cosa Nostra begins to make sense as a unifying idea. It reflects a belief that this system is not temporary. It is not opportunistic. It is legitimate in its own internal logic. To belong is to accept obligations. To refuse is to isolate oneself. This is not enforced with constant violence. Most of the time, it is enforced with expectation. With the quiet knowledge that participation brings protection, and absence brings vulnerability. As the state continues to strengthen toward the end of the century, tensions increase. Officials begin to notice patterns. Investigations are attempted. Arrests are made. But progress is slow. Evidence disappears. Witnesses retract statements. Communities remain closed. From the outside, this appears as obstruction. From within, it feels like preservation. There is a deep belief at work here that external authority is temporary, while local systems endure. Empires have come and gone. Kings have ruled and vanished. Why would this new state be any different? This belief gives the mafia patience. It does not rush to dominate openly. It embeds itself quietly into daily life. It learns which officials can be influenced and which should be avoided. It learns when to retreat and when to assert itself. By the late 19th century, something important has changed. The mafia is no longer simply filling a void left by the absence of law. It now exists alongside the law, shaping it indirectly. It is no longer merely reactive. It is strategic. This shift will have consequences. As we pause here, let the image soften again. Picture an evening street. Oil lamps glow faintly. Conversations happen behind closed doors. The state exists, but it does not fully enter this space. Two systems now occupy the same land. One is written, formal, and aspiring to modernity. The other is unwritten, personal, and deeply rooted. Neither disappears. As night deepens, the tension between these worlds grows quietly stronger. In the next part, we will begin to see how this tension travels beyond Sicily itself, carried by people, necessity, and opportunity, crossing water and reshaping lives far from the island. Part 4: across the water, carrying old rules. As we move gently onward, the shoreline comes into view. The sea has always been part of Sicily's story. It brings food, weather, strangers, and ideas. It also offers escape. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the water begins to carry something else as well. People. Economic pressure tightens across the island. Population grows. Land remains limited. Opportunities feel increasingly constrained. The promises of the Italian state have not reached everyone equally, and for many families, survival still feels uncertain. So they leave. I want you to imagine a harbor at dawn. Steam rises from the water. Wooden crates are stacked along the docks. Families stand close together, holding what little they can carry. There is excitement here, but also grief. Leaving is not failure. It is necessity. As Sicilians board ships bound for North and South America, they do not leave their customs behind. They carry them quietly, the same way they carry recipes, prayers, and dialects spoken softly among kin. And among these customs are the rules of trust, loyalty, and silence that have shaped life back home. This is an important moment. The Mafia does not travel as a single organization crossing the sea intact. It travels in fragments, in habits, in expectations, in ways of solving problems when official systems feel unfamiliar or hostile. When immigrants arrive in places like New York, Buenos Aires, and New Orleans, they step into societies that are loud, crowded, and fast-moving. The state is present here, but it does not always feel welcoming. Language barriers isolate communities. Employment is unstable. Housing is crowded. Discrimination is common. Once again, people turn inward. Neighborhoods form along familiar lines. Streets become extensions of villages left behind. In places like Little Italy, trust flows through family connections and shared origin. Outsiders are viewed cautiously. Authority remains something to be navigated, not embraced. The old patterns fit the new world surprisingly well. Those who know how to organize, enforce agreements, and command loyalty quickly find their footing. Informal protection networks emerge around docks, markets, construction sites, and labor unions. Disputes are resolved privately. Debts are collected quietly. respect remains central. This is not yet the American Mafia of popular imagination. It is still local, still small scale, still largely invisible to the broader society. But the conditions that allowed power to grow in Sicily exist here too, just in different forms. Weak oversight. Rapid economic change. Communities wary of external authority. The sea has not diluted the system. It has expanded its reach. Back in Sicily, the island is not untouched by this migration. Money flows back through remittances. Connections stretch across continents. Opportunities multiply. The idea that influence can extend beyond the village becomes real. What once felt rooted in land now feels mobile. At the same time, modernity presses closer at home. Railways expand. Cities grow. The Italian state continues its efforts to assert control. Tensions rise. The mafia adapts by becoming more discreet, more selective, more strategic. In urban centers like Palermo, these changes are visible if you know where to look. Construction projects require coordination. Contracts pass through familiar hands. New industries bring new chances to extract influence without drawing attention. The idea of organization strengthens. Families begin to recognize each other across regions. Meetings happen quietly. Boundaries are negotiated. The notion of a shared identity, later understood as Cosa Nostra, becomes more meaningful. It suggests not just local authority, but participation in a wider system. Still, this system resists centralization. Independence remains valued. Loyalty is personal before it is institutional. No single figure controls everything. Balance is maintained through understanding rather than decree. Across the ocean, similar dynamics unfold. In immigrant neighborhoods, figures who can navigate both the old world codes and the new world systems gain particular influence. They translate between languages, laws, and expectations. They know which officials to avoid, which can be persuaded, and which should be respected. They do not see themselves as criminals. They see themselves as organizers, fixers, protectors. This self-perception matters. It shapes how violence is used and how often. Excessive force attracts attention. Attention threatens stability. Stability is always the priority. As the early 20th century progresses, these networks become more visible to authorities. Journalists begin to notice patterns. Police observe familiar names appearing repeatedly. But without cooperation from within the communities, enforcement remains limited. Silence holds. It is tempting to view this spread as deliberate expansion. In truth, it is more organic. The mafia follows people because it is embedded in how some people understand order. It thrives wherever gaps exist between law and lived reality. The ocean does not erase memory. It carries it. As we rest here, imagine the quiet continuity of these systems. A man in Sicily settling a dispute. Another, thousands of miles away, doing the same thing in a crowded city street. Different languages. Different surroundings. The same logic. This is how the mafia becomes transnational without ever truly becoming centralized. It is a shared grammar of power, spoken wherever conditions allow it to make sense. In the stillness of this moment, nothing has yet reached its peak. The forces we are observing are still aligning. Greater challenges are coming. Stronger states. louder scrutiny, new ideologies. But for now, the system endures quietly, adapting once again. Let the harbor fade from view. Let the ship disappear into the horizon. The night deepens, and the story continues to unfold. Part 5. The state pushes back. As we drift a little further into the night, the tone of the story shifts. For the first time, the state does not arrive quietly. The early 20th century brings with it a different kind of authority, one that does not accept coexistence and does not tolerate ambiguity. Across Italy, the idea of order hardens. Uniforms become sharper. Language becomes louder. The promise is no longer negotiation, but control. This is the era of Benito Mussolini. I want you to imagine Sicily during these years. The island still looks familiar on the surface. Olive groves still catch the light. Markets still open at dawn. Families still gather in the evenings. But beneath this calm, pressure builds. The fascist regime views the mafia not as a parallel system, but as a direct challenge. A rival authority cannot be tolerated in a state that demands total loyalty. Silence, once ignored or exploited, now appears suspicious. Local power, once useful, is now threatening. For the first time, the mafia faces a government that does not merely wish to manage it, but to break it. The campaign is deliberate and highly symbolic. Mussolini wants Sicily to see the state, to feel it, to fear it more than any local figure. He appoints a special prefect to the island, a man given extraordinary authority and a single purpose: to dismantle the mafia's influence. That man is Cesare Mori. Mori arrives with determination and broad powers. He does not rely on quiet accommodation. He uses mass arrests, public trials, and sweeping investigations. Villages are surrounded. Homes are searched. Entire communities are interrogated. For people who have lived generations under informal systems, this feels invasive and destabilizing. Silence, once a shield, becomes a liability. Some cooperate. Many do not. Others flee. The mafia, faced with unprecedented pressure, adapts again. Leaders go underground. Some relocate. Others dissolve their visible operations, waiting patiently for the storm to pass. This is an important moment to pause and reflect. From the outside, this period is often described as a defeat for the mafia. And in many ways, it is. Structures are damaged. Networks are disrupted. Fear shifts direction. The state asserts itself forcefully in places where it once felt distant. But something deeper is happening as well. The mafia does not disappear. It contracts. It learns restraint. It learns invisibility. It learns how to survive not by dominance, but by absence. Members become quieter, more cautious, more selective. The idea that power must always be visible is abandoned. This lesson will matter later. For ordinary Sicilians, the fascist campaign is deeply unsettling. Some welcome the disruption, hopeful that the old systems might finally loosen their grip. Others feel caught between two authorities, unsure which is more dangerous. Trust becomes fragile. The state demands loyalty, but offers little room for local autonomy. The mafia once offered predictability, but now brings risk. People adapt as best they can, lowering their voices even further, sharing less, watching carefully. In cities like Palermo, the atmosphere grows tense. Public displays of authority increase. Banners and slogans appear. The message is constant and unavoidable. There is only one power now, and it does not share. For a time, it seems as though the Mafia may truly be broken. But history has a way of testing certainty. The fascist state is strong, but it is also rigid. It relies heavily on centralized control and symbolic dominance. When cracks appear, they widen quickly. When the regime eventually collapses during the chaos of the Second World War, the structures it enforced dissolve with surprising speed. And into the vacuum left behind, old systems begin to stir. This is where patience reveals its value. The Mafia has not forgotten how to operate in absence. It has centuries of experience in exactly this condition. As Allied forces land in Sicily and fascist authority collapses, confusion reigns. Administrations change overnight. New officials arrive with limited knowledge of local dynamics. Once again, order feels uncertain. Those who know the land, the people, and the old networks quietly re-emerge. They offer stability. They provide guidance. They help restore daily function. To outside authorities focused on larger military and political goals, this assistance appears helpful. Once again, local power proves useful. The Mafia does not return in the same form it once held. It returns changed by repression. More cautious. More organized internally. Less interested in visibility, more focused on longevity. The lessons of the fascist crackdown linger. Never allow the state to see the full structure. Never rely on a single leader. Never mistake quiet for weakness. As the war ends and Italy rebuilds, the Mafia finds itself in familiar territory once more. A fragile state. Rapid change. Economic uncertainty. Communities looking inward for stability. The conditions that once gave it life have returned, shaped by new circumstances but rooted in the same absence. As we rest here, let the scene soften again. Imagine a village at dusk after years of upheaval. Buildings damaged but standing. People tired but enduring. Old faces reappearing quietly in familiar places. No announcements. No declarations. Just continuity. The fascist era tried to erase the Mafia through force. It failed not because force was insufficient, but because it misunderstood what it was trying to destroy. The Mafia was never only an organization. It was a method of surviving uncertainty. In the stillness of this moment, the island exhales. The war has passed. The regime has fallen. And something old, reshaped by pressure, is preparing to move forward once again. Part 6, After the War, the quiet returns. When the war finally loosens its grip on the island, what remains is not peace so much as exhaustion. Sicily in the late 1940s feels worn thin. Bomb buildings sit beside untouched ones. Roads exist in fragments. Authority changes hands quickly and often. The fascist banners are gone, but nothing solid has fully replaced them yet. People are tired of ideology. They want food, stability, and something that resembles normal life. In moments like this, silence becomes useful again. I want you to imagine a village at dawn after the war. The air smells of dust and smoke that has not yet fully cleared. Men gather near a damaged wall, speaking quietly. Women sweep doorways that lead into half-repaired homes. Children play among stones without understanding how recently those stones fell. The state is present again, but unevenly. New officials arrive from Rome. Allied administrators pass through briefly. Paperwork piles up. Decisions move slowly. Everyone agrees that reconstruction is necessary, but few agree on how it should happen. And into this familiar uncertainty, old networks awaken. The Mafia does not reappear with fanfare. It does not reclaim territory through open force. Instead, it offers what it has always offered best: solutions, connections, certainty. Land disputes left unresolved during the war need settling. Black markets fill gaps left by rationing. Construction materials must be sourced. Labor must be organized. Contracts must be enforced quickly, without waiting for courts that barely function. Those who know how to make things happen quietly become indispensable once again. In cities like Palermo, reconstruction creates opportunity. Buildings need to be rebuilt. Roads repaired. Entire neighborhoods reshaped. Money begins to flow into Sicily through government programs and foreign aid. Where money flows faster than oversight, influence follows. The Mafia positions itself not as opposition to recovery, but as facilitator of it. It helps coordinate labor. It ensures materials arrive. It discourages disruption. On paper, projects look legitimate. In practice, they are quietly shaped by familiar hands. This is how power reinvents itself. Violence remains restrained. The lessons of the fascist crackdown are still fresh. Visibility is avoided. Authority is exercised indirectly, through influence rather than intimidation. A contractor knows which bid will succeed without being told. A laborer knows where to work and where not to ask questions. Silence becomes professional. At the same time, Sicily's relationship with the rest of Italy remains strained. The island feels neglected. Promises of investment are slow to materialize. Many Sicilians continue to view the state as distant and unreliable. Local systems fill the emotional gap as well as the practical one. The Mafia presents itself, once again, as part of the community. Not openly celebrated, but quietly accepted. It resolves problems quickly. It understands local needs. It does not speak in slogans. For many, this feels preferable to abstract governance. Across the ocean, these same years bring transformation to immigrant communities. In the United States, wartime industries have expanded cities. Prohibition has ended, but the infrastructure built around it remains. Networks formed during earlier decades now adapt to new forms of profit. Connections between Sicily and the Americas strengthen. Money moves back and forth. People travel. Ideas circulate. The Mafia is no longer confined to local dispute or agricultural protection. It begins to think in terms of logistics, trade, and international opportunity. This is where scale begins to matter. Back in Sicily, political instability creates new alliances. The Cold War looms. Ideological fears shape policy. Anti-communist sentiment becomes a priority for Western-aligned governments. Local power brokers who can influence voting blocs and suppress unrest gain new value. Once again, the line between criminality and governance blurs. The Mafia does not campaign openly, but it influences outcomes quietly. It encourages participation or discourages it. It signals preferences without declarations. Politicians who understand this dynamic benefit. Those who ignore it struggle. This mutual usefulness strengthens the system. The mafia learns how to operate within modern politics without fully entering it. It does not seek office. It seeks access. It does not want visibility. It wants leverage. This distinction allows it to persist while appearing peripheral. In rural areas, traditional roles remain strong. Land, labor, and protection still define influence. In urban spaces, new forms of control emerge. Construction, transportation, waste management, and import-export businesses become avenues for quiet profit. The mafia becomes economically diverse. It also becomes more internally disciplined. Membership is controlled carefully. Trust is tested. Information is compartmentalized. No one sees the full picture. This structure protects the whole when parts are exposed. The idea of Cosa Nostra now carries weight not just as identity, but as system. It suggests rules, continuity, and a shared understanding that survives individual members. And yet, to most people living alongside it, daily life remains unremarkable. The mafia does not announce itself. It is experienced indirectly, through how smoothly things happen, through how problems disappear, through how certain names carry influence without explanation. This invisibility is its greatest strength. As we pause here, notice how the rhythm of the story has slowed again. After the noise of war and repression, quiet has returned. But it is not the quiet of innocence. It is the quiet of adaptation. The mafia has learned from every challenge it has faced. From absent states. From aggressive regimes. From war itself. Each lesson has refined its approach. Patience. Discretion. Embedded power. In the stillness of post-war Sicily, these traits find fertile ground once more. Let the evening settle. Picture half-rebuilt streets under soft light. Conversations happening behind shutters. Plans forming without urgency. Nothing dramatic is happening tonight. And that is precisely the point. Part 7. When quiet wealth became dangerous. As we continue forward, the tempo of the world begins to quicken. The calm that settled after the war does not last forever. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Sicily finds itself pulled into currents far larger than the island itself. Money accelerates. Cities expand. Expectations rise. And the systems that once thrived in patience begin to feel pressure from abundance. I want you to imagine Palermo at night during these years. Streetlights glow over newly paved roads. Construction cranes loom against the dark sky. Apartment blocks rise where gardens once stood. The city feels alive, optimistic, and unsettled all at once. This is the moment when quiet influence starts to touch loud wealth. Post-war reconstruction has matured into full-scale development. Public funds, private investment, and speculative construction pour into urban centers. Entire neighborhoods are reshaped rapidly, often without meaningful oversight. Contracts change hands quickly. Permits appear with surprising ease. This period will later be remembered as a transformation of the city itself. For the mafia, these changes bring opportunity and risk in equal measure. Construction is ideal terrain for quiet power. It requires coordination across many layers. Land ownership, labor, materials, permits, timelines. Each point of friction creates space for intervention. The Mafia positions itself not as the face of development, but as the mechanism that ensures it proceeds without interruption. A building rises smoothly because no disputes surface. A strike does not happen because concerns are resolved privately. A rival contractor withdraws because he understands the signals. From the outside, the city appears to be modernizing. From within, the same familiar logic governs the process. But scale changes everything. As money increases, so do stakes. As profits grow, so does competition. The careful balance that once kept violence rare begins to strain. Internal disagreements become harder to contain quietly. Younger members see wealth not as something to preserve slowly, but something to seize quickly. Patience begins to erode. At the same time, Sicily is no longer isolated from global currents. Trade routes expand. Travel becomes easier. Ideas circulate faster. The island's position in the Mediterranean once again makes it a crossroads. And soon, a new commodity begins to reshape everything. Heroin. This is not introduced with fanfare. At first, it appears as just another opportunity. A product moving quietly through ports, leveraging existing smuggling networks. The Mafia understands logistics. It understands discretion. It understands how to move goods without attracting attention. What it does not yet fully understand is how transformative this trade will become. Heroin connects Sicily directly to global markets. To laboratories, suppliers, distributors, and consumers thousands of miles away. Profits dwarf anything previously known. The numbers are no longer local. They are international. And international money does not stay quiet easily. In places like Palermo, the influx of drug money amplifies existing tensions. Some families embrace the trade fully. Others resist, wary of attention and destabilization. Internal debates sharpen. Loyalty is tested not just by honor, but by profit. The old balance begins to crack. This is where generational divides emerge more clearly. Older figures remember repression, scarcity, and survival through invisibility. Younger figures see a different world. One where risk brings reward quickly. One where restraint feels like weakness. The shared understanding that once governed behavior begins to fragment. Violence increases, not dramatically at first, but noticeably. Messages that were once implied now need reinforcement. Trust becomes harder to maintain as money grows faster than relationships. The Mafia, long defined by quiet continuity, begins to face an internal identity crisis. Across the ocean, the consequences of this trade are already unfolding. Distribution networks expand in North America. Cities struggle with addiction and crime. Law enforcement attention intensifies. International cooperation begins to take shape. For the first time, the Mafia is no longer just a local or national concern. It becomes part of a global problem. This shift draws scrutiny. Journalists start asking sharper questions. Judges begin connecting patterns. Investigations become more sophisticated. The assumption that silence alone can protect the system becomes less certain. Still, the Mafia adapts. It compartmentalizes further. It separates decision-making from execution. It uses intermediaries. It invests profits into legitimate businesses to mask origins. Construction, waste management, transportation, and real estate become tools for laundering money quietly. The organization grows more complex. This complexity creates resilience, but also fragility. The more layers exist, the more points can fail. The more people involved, the harder silence becomes to enforce. In Sicily's towns and cities, ordinary people begin to feel the shift. Violence, though still selective, becomes harder to ignore. Explosions echo at night. Funerals become more frequent. Fear changes shape. What was once predictable now feels volatile. The state, too, begins to respond differently. Post-war tolerance gives way to concern. Specialized investigative units form. Anti-mafia rhetoric grows louder. The idea that these systems can be managed quietly begins to fade. The mafia has crossed a threshold. By entering the world of global narcotics, it has gained unprecedented wealth and influence. But it has also invited scrutiny that cannot be easily deflected. The patience that once defined its survival is now tested by urgency. This is a turning point. As we rest here, let the city lights dim slightly in your imagination. Hear the distant hum of traffic. Feel the tension beneath the surface. Something old has grown too large to remain invisible. The quiet system that thrived in absence now operates in a crowded, watched world. In the stillness of this moment, the mafia stands at a crossroads of its own making. Continue quietly and risk losing ground to faster, louder forces. Or expand aggressively and invite confrontation with the state. Neither path offers safety. As the night deepens, the story prepares to move into darker territory. In the next part, these pressures will explode into open conflict, reshaping Sicily and shattering the illusion that silence alone can hold everything together. Part 8. When silence broke. As we drift into this next chapter, the night feels heavier. For generations, the mafia survived by remaining partially unseen. It lived between moments, beneath official structures, inside habits so old they felt natural. But by the late 1970s and early 1980s, the balance that sustained this quiet power begins to fail. The system has grown too wealthy, too interconnected, and too internally divided to remain contained. Silence, once protective, begins to fracture. I want you to imagine Palermo during these years. The city still moves through its daily rhythms. Shops open. Children go to school. Cafes fill in the afternoon. But there is an undercurrent now, a tension that hums beneath ordinary life. People listen more carefully. They watch the street a moment longer before crossing. Conversations stop abruptly when unfamiliar footsteps approach. This is no longer the calm of discretion. It is the quiet of anticipation. Inside the mafia itself, conflicts intensify. The heroin trade has reshaped priorities. Money arrives faster than trust can keep pace. Alliances once held together by mutual understanding strain under the weight of profit and ambition. Some families believe expansion is inevitable. Others fear it will bring ruin. Disagreements that once would have been negotiated quietly now harden into opposition. What follows is not chaos, but something colder. The Second Mafia War, as it will later be called, is not a spontaneous eruption. It is calculated, strategic, methodical. One faction seeks to consolidate power decisively, eliminating rivals rather than coexisting with them. The old rules about balance and restraint are rewritten. Violence becomes a tool not just of message, but of restructuring. Assassinations occur with increasing frequency. Targets are chosen carefully. The goal is not to intimidate the public, but to dismantle internal opposition completely. Entire leadership structures are removed in waves. The city feels the impact even if the motives remain obscured. Bodies appear in places where they cannot be ignored. News reports grow darker. The sense that these events are isolated incidents becomes harder to maintain. People begin to whisper that something fundamental is shifting. Fear changes character. Where once it was predictable, now it feels arbitrary. Where once it was contained within known boundaries, now it spills into public spaces. The understanding that staying quiet ensures safety begins to feel uncertain. This is the moment when the Mafia's internal crisis becomes a social one. At the same time, the Italian state begins to respond with new seriousness. The scale of violence makes denial impossible. Political pressure mounts. Public outrage grows. A new generation of magistrates and investigators emerges, less willing to accept the limits that once defined enforcement. They approach the problem differently. Instead of chasing individual crimes, they begin to examine the system itself. Patterns, hierarchies, financial flows. Testimonies are connected across cases. Fragmented information is assembled into a broader picture. This approach challenges the Mafia's deepest assumption: that no one outside can ever truly understand how it works. The illusion of invisibility weakens. In Palermo's courthouse, long hours pass as documents are reviewed, statements compared, timelines aligned. The work is quiet, patient, and dangerous. It relies not on force, but on persistence. For the Mafia, this is unsettling. Violence escalates in response, not only against rivals, but increasingly against representatives of the state. Judges, police officers, journalists, and politicians become targets. The message is no longer internal. It is outward. Control is asserted through shock. Bombings echo through streets. Car explosions tear through routines. The city absorbs these moments with a kind of stunned endurance. Life continues, but it does so with visible scars. Ordinary people are no longer just observers. They are witnesses. This is a profound shift. For decades, many Sicilians lived alongside the Mafia without confronting it directly. It was present, but distant. Now, it feels intrusive, unpredictable, and increasingly incompatible with daily life. Silence, once a shared survival strategy, begins to feel like complicity. Some begin to speak, cautiously. Others leave. Many remain frozen between fear and exhaustion. The old codes still hold power, but they no longer feel unquestionable. Inside the Mafia, the cost of consolidation becomes clear. Victory comes at the price of exposure. The more centralized and aggressive the organization becomes, the more legible it is to those studying it. Power has become louder, and loudness invites attention. The state, learning from past failures, begins to coordinate more effectively. Specialized units form. Legal frameworks evolve. Cooperation across regions improves. The idea that the Mafia can be dismantled rather than managed gains traction. This does not happen quickly. It does not happen cleanly. But it begins. In Palermo, nights are restless. Sirens cut through the dark. Newspapers carry familiar names. Funerals follow funerals. The sense of inevitability that once surrounded the Mafia weakens. It is still powerful, still dangerous, but no longer untouchable. As we pause here, let the city quiet again in your imagination. The streets empty, lights dim behind shutters. Somewhere, files sit open on a desk. Somewhere else, decisions are being made that will ripple outward. This is the moment when the Mafia's greatest strength becomes its vulnerability. By abandoning patience for dominance, it invites confrontation with a state that has finally learned how to look closely. The old balance is gone. What replaces it will be shaped by courage, tragedy, and a reckoning long delayed. In the next part, we will sit with those who chose to confront this system directly, and with the cost of that choice, a cost that will leave a permanent mark on Italy's collective memory. Part 9: Those who chose to stand. As we move gently onward, the story slows again, not because events are quiet, but because the weight of them demands care. There are moments in history when systems begin to crack not from external force alone, but from individuals who decide that silence has gone on long enough. This is one of those moments. The late 1970s and 1980s bring forward people who do something rare in a landscape shaped by fear. They choose to look directly at the structure itself. I want you to imagine a courthouse early in the morning. The stone is cool. The air is still. Files are stacked neatly on desks. There is no drama here yet, only preparation. The work ahead is slow, meticulous, and dangerous in ways that do not announce themselves. This is the world entered by magistrates like Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. They are not mythic figures at the beginning. They are professionals shaped by the same Sicily as everyone else. They understand the codes. They understand the silences. And precisely because of that, they recognize something essential. The Mafia cannot be confronted as a series of isolated crimes. It must be understood as a system. This insight changes everything. Rather than focusing only on individual murders or transactions, they begin to map relationships. Who meets whom? Who profits when a project moves forward? How money travels? How decisions cascade quietly across neighborhoods and families? It is patient work, requiring an attention to detail that borders on obsession. It also requires trust, something in short supply. For decades, witnesses have remained silent not because they do not know anything, but because speaking has felt unthinkable. To talk is to step outside the protective circle of familiarity. It is to gamble with one's life, and often with the lives of family members. Breaking this silence requires more than legal authority. It requires credibility. Falcone and Borsellino understand this. They do not posture. They do not promise safety they cannot provide. They work carefully to build systems of protection, limited as they are, and to demonstrate that speaking can lead somewhere meaningful. Slowly, cautiously, something begins to change. A few insiders decide to cooperate. These individuals are often described later with a single word, pentiti, those who have repented. But the word does not capture the complexity of their choice. They are not saints. They are participants in violence and crime. What matters is that they carry knowledge that has never been articulated publicly before. Through their testimonies, the Mafia begins to speak in its own voice. Names appear. Structures emerge. Hierarchies that once existed only as rumor become visible on paper. The idea of Cosa Nostra as a coordinated entity gains legal recognition. This is a profound shift. For the first time, the mafia is no longer only something felt or feared. It is something described, analyzed, and named within the framework of the law. This allows prosecutors to pursue not just actions, but membership itself. The culmination of this effort arrives in the mid-1980s with the Maxi trial. Hundreds of defendants. Years of preparation. An unprecedented attempt to hold an entire criminal system accountable at once. The courtroom itself becomes symbolic. Reinforced walls. Heavy security. Rows of defendants seated together. The state is making a statement not with rhetoric, but with process. The trial unfolds slowly. Testimony follows testimony. Defense strategies seek to discredit witnesses and overwhelm the court with complexity. But the structure holds. For many Sicilians watching from a distance, the experience is surreal. Names once spoken only in whispers are now printed in newspapers. Patterns that felt inevitable are revealed as constructed. The mafia, long thought invincible, appears suddenly fragile. This visibility has consequences. Within the mafia, the response is ruthless. Those who cooperate are marked. Those who enable the prosecutions are targeted. The message is clear. This challenge will not be tolerated. Threats escalate. Security tightens. Judges live under constant guard. Daily routines shrink. Simple acts, walking outside, driving a familiar route, become calculated risks. And still, the work continues. This is what gives this moment its particular gravity. It is not driven by hope alone, nor by idealism. It is driven by a disciplined commitment to process, even when the cost is fully understood. For the public, something shifts as well. The trials force a reckoning. They make it harder to maintain the comfortable distance that once allowed coexistence. People begin to argue openly. In cafes. In homes. In schools. Silence, once shared, becomes contested. Some fear the consequences of exposure. Others feel a cautious pride. The idea that the mafia is a permanent, unchangeable feature of Sicilian life begins to weaken. This does not mean fear disappears. It does not. But it changes direction. Instead of being diffuse and ambient, it becomes focused and contextual. People see that resistance is possible, though costly. The mafia, in turn, faces a dilemma. To retreat would suggest weakness. To escalate would invite further scrutiny. The organization responds with violence designed not just to punish, but to shock society back into submission. This sets the stage for tragedy. As we rest here, imagine the quiet tension of these years. The steady hum of security vehicles. The weight of files carried home late at night. The knowledge that progress is real, but fragile. This is not a moment of resolution. It is a moment of exposure. Systems that thrived in shadow struggle under light. Individuals who step forward carry a burden larger than themselves. And the island itself seems to hold its breath, uncertain which force will ultimately prevail. In the stillness that follows, understand this. The choice to stand does not end the mafia. But it alters the story irrevocably. It introduces accountability into a world built on silence. In the next part, we will sit with the cost of this confrontation, with the violence that follows, and with the way loss reshapes both the mafia and the society that has lived alongside it for so long. Part 10. The cost of being seen. As we drift into this part of the story, the air feels tighter, as if the night itself has drawn closer. There are moments when history pauses, not because nothing is happening, but because something irreversible is about to occur. Sicily enters one of those moments in the early 1990s. The long effort to expose the Mafia has reached a point where retreat is no longer possible for either side. The system that thrived in silence has been seen too clearly. I want you to imagine an ordinary afternoon. A stretch of highway under a bright sky. Traffic moving at a familiar pace. Nothing about the scene suggests significance. And yet, beneath the asphalt, something waits. On a day in 1992, that waiting ends. The assassination of Giovanni Falcone is not quiet. It is not contained. It is not ambiguous. An enormous explosion tears through the road near Capaci, killing Falcone, his wife, and members of his security detail. The violence is overwhelming, unmistakable, impossible to rationalize as anything but a declaration. This is not merely an act of revenge. It is a message sent at full volume. For decades, the Mafia relied on controlled violence, calibrated carefully to maintain order without drawing excessive attention. This act abandons that restraint. It is designed to shock the state, to terrify the public, and to demonstrate that no amount of legal progress can protect those who challenge the system. Sicily absorbs the impact in stunned silence. The explosion reverberates far beyond the island. News spreads quickly. Images circulate. The scale of the attack forces recognition even from those who had remained emotionally distant. The Mafia has crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. And yet, the story does not pause to grieve. Only weeks later, another blow follows. Paolo Borsellino, Falcone's colleague and friend, is killed by a car bomb in Palermo. The timing is brutal. The message is unmistakable. Anyone who continues this work will meet the same fate. The Mafia is attempting to restore silence through terror. For many Sicilians, this moment feels like a breaking point. The violence is no longer abstract. It has reached into the heart of civic life. Judges, symbols of law and reason, are killed in public spaces. The boundary between criminal conflict and societal trauma collapses. Grief spreads, but so does something else. Anger. Public funerals draw massive crowds. Flowers pile up outside courthouses. Handwritten notes appear on walls. People who have spent lifetimes navigating around the Mafia's presence suddenly speak openly, not in whispers, but aloud. The old social contract fractures. For the first time in generations, the Mafia's violence produces not resignation, but backlash. The sheer visibility of these killings undermines the logic that silence equals safety. It becomes clear that quiet accommodation does not guarantee protection. This realization changes the emotional landscape of Sicily. The state responds with unprecedented force. Emergency measures are enacted. Arrests increase. Investigations accelerate. Cooperation between police, prosecutors, and international partners deepens. Legal tools are expanded. Witness protection programs receive greater support. The machinery of enforcement grows louder and more coordinated. Inside the Mafia, the consequences are severe. The decision to escalate violence so publicly has unintended effects. While it intimidates some, it galvanizes others. Informants come forward in greater numbers. Communities that once closed ranks begin to fracture under pressure and moral exhaustion. The organization's internal cohesion weakens. What once felt like a unified system now shows strain. Distrust spreads. Leaders worry about betrayal. The same compartmentalization that once provided security now amplifies paranoia. No one feels fully safe, not from the state, and not from within. This is the paradox of exposure. The Mafia attempted to reassert control through spectacle, but spectacle invites scrutiny. It forces clarity. It strips away the ambiguity that allowed coexistence. For ordinary people, daily life becomes a negotiation between fear and resolve. Streets feel different. Conversations carry a new weight. Children ask questions their parents struggle to answer. The idea that the Mafia is simply part of the environment becomes harder to accept. Loss reshapes perception. The figures of Falcone and Borsellino begin to take on symbolic meaning beyond their individual lives. They represent a possibility that once seemed unreachable. That the Mafia can be named, confronted, and challenged within the law. Their deaths do not end the effort. They intensify it. This does not mean victory arrives quickly or cleanly. Violence continues. Retaliation persists. The Mafia remains powerful and dangerous. But the trajectory has changed. The system is no longer invisible, and it can no longer rely on widespread acceptance or quiet tolerance. The island itself seems to respond. Civic movements emerge. Educational programs begin addressing the Mafia openly. Memorials are built not just to honor the dead, but to assert memory. Remembering becomes a form of resistance. Silence is no longer neutral. As we sit with this moment, let the noise fade slightly. Imagine the city after a funeral. Streets swept clean. Flowers wilting in the sun. A sense of exhaustion, but also resolve. History does not move forward on courage alone. It moves on accumulation. Of effort. Of attention. Of refusal to forget. The Mafia's attempt to erase opposition through terror fails in its deepest aim. It cannot restore the old quiet. Too many eyes are open now. Too many names have been spoken. The cost of being seen has been paid in blood. And that cost leaves a mark that cannot be undone. In the stillness that follows, Sicily enters a new phase. One defined not by absence, but by confrontation. Not by whispered accommodation, but by uneasy engagement with the truth of what has existed for so long. Part 11, After the Shock, The Long Quiet. As we move onward, the pace of the story slows again, not because danger has passed, but because it has changed its shape. The early 1990s leave Sicily shaken. The violence that took the lives of Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino does not fade quickly. It settles into the streets, into conversations, into memory. The island carries a kind of collective exhaustion, the sort that follows when something long avoided can no longer be ignored. The Mafia, too, is exhausted. The strategy of terror has failed to restore the old balance. Instead of forcing society back into silence, it has provoked sustained confrontation. Arrests continue. Trials move forward. Informants step out of the shadows. The idea that the Mafia can operate openly through fear alone no longer holds. And so, once again, adaptation begins. I want you to imagine Palermo in the late 1990s. The city feels quieter than it did during the years of bombings. Not peaceful exactly, but subdued. Cafes reopen without constant dread. streets feel cautiously ordinary. Life resumes, though not without memory. This quiet is not innocence. It is strategy. Inside the mafia, leadership has changed hands. Many figures from the previous era are imprisoned, dead, or compromised. The lessons of exposure have been absorbed deeply. Visibility is now understood as vulnerability. Loud power has proven dangerous. The response is deliberate retreat. The mafia pulls back from overt violence. It reduces public displays. It avoids actions that might provoke mass outrage or international attention. The goal is no longer dominance through fear, but survival through invisibility. This shift marks a significant transformation. The organization does not disappear. It embeds itself more deeply into legitimate-looking structures. Businesses, contracts, bureaucratic processes. Influence is exercised through paperwork rather than weapons. Decisions are made quietly, often legally on the surface, though shaped behind the scenes. Construction remains important, but now it is subtler. Waste management, logistics, retail, and services become preferred avenues. These sectors offer steady income, low visibility, and plausible deniability. Crime becomes administrative. At the same time, the Italian state continues to refine its approach. New laws strengthen the ability to seize assets. Property confiscated from mafia figures is repurposed for public use. Farms become cooperatives. Buildings become community centers. This symbolic reversal matters deeply. Power is not only punished. It is reclaimed. For many Sicilians, this is one of the most meaningful changes. Seeing former mafia properties used openly for the public good disrupts the old narrative of inevitability. It suggests that the system can be dismantled piece by piece, not just resisted. Still, fear does not vanish. Silence remains part of daily life, though it is no longer unquestioned. People speak more openly about the mafia than they once did, but caution persists. Trust is rebuilt slowly. Memory tempers optimism. Inside Palermo, the transformation is visible in small ways. Murals appear honoring judges and journalists. Schools include lessons about the mafia's history. Civic organizations promote transparency and accountability. These efforts are quiet, but intentional. The mafia watches and adjusts. Rather than confronting these changes directly, it avoids them. It stays out of the spotlight. It avoids creating martyrs. It understands now that public sentiment matters more than it once did. This restraint is not ethical. It is tactical. Within the organization, discipline tightens. Membership becomes more selective. Communication becomes more cautious. Trust is limited. The idea that anyone could become an informant lingers constantly. Paranoia replaces confidence. This internal tension weakens cohesion. Without open violence to enforce loyalty, leadership relies on subtle pressure and economic dependence. Control is exercised through access rather than fear. This makes the mafia quieter, but also less stable. Across Italy, and beyond, law enforcement cooperation improves. Financial crimes units track money flows. International partnerships address trafficking routes. Technology makes secrecy harder to maintain. The mafia responds by fragmenting further. Rather than a single unified force, it becomes a constellation of smaller, semi-autonomous groups. Coordination exists, but it is cautious. No one wants to attract attention by appearing too powerful. This fragmentation changes how the mafia is experienced. For many ordinary people, it becomes less visible, less intrusive, but also less predictable. Influence is felt indirectly, through contracts that never quite go to the expected bidder, through businesses that seem to succeed without clear reason, through the quiet persistence of certain names in certain places. The sense of an all-encompassing presence fades. The sense of something lingering remains. This is the long aftermath. The years following the great confrontations are not dramatic. They are not marked by constant violence or clear victories. They are defined by endurance, by slow institutional work, by cultural shifts that take generations. The mafia is no longer a shadow government, but it is not gone. It exists in the margins, testing boundaries, watching for weakness, retreating when pressure rises. For Sicilian society, this creates a new kind of tension. The enemy is no longer obvious. It does not announce itself. It blends into the background of ordinary life. This makes resistance more complex. It requires vigilance rather than bravery, consistency rather than heroism. Memory becomes a tool. The names of Falcone and Borsellino are spoken not as relics of a closed chapter, but as reminders of what exposure can cost and what it can achieve. Their legacy shapes how institutions train new magistrates, how journalists approach investigations, how citizens understand their own role. The mafia understands this legacy too. It knows that another attempt to rule through terror would fail even faster than the last. The social conditions that once allowed silence to protect the system have changed irreversibly. And so it waits. This waiting is not passive. It is attentive. It looks for moments of distraction, economic downturns, political instability, fatigue, the same gaps it has always relied on. But the world it watches is no longer the same one it once mastered. As we rest here, let the quiet settle. Imagine a street at dusk. Shops closing. Lights turning on behind windows. Life proceeding cautiously, deliberately. The shock has passed. The scars remain. The battle is no longer loud, but it is ongoing. In the stillness of this moment, understand that survival does not always look like victory. Sometimes it looks like persistence. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like blending into the background and waiting for history to blink. In the next part, we will look more closely at how this quieter mafia reshapes itself in the modern era, navigating globalization, technology, and a society that no longer accepts the comfort of not knowing. Part 12: Power Without a Face. As we move further into the story, the world around Sicily begins to feel unmistakably modern. The turn of the century does not arrive with banners or declarations. It arrives quietly, through screens, databases, and transactions that happen faster than anyone can fully observe. For the mafia, this shift is both threatening and full of possibility. The old rules still matter, but they now operate inside a landscape shaped by technology, globalization, and constant observation. I want you to imagine Palermo at dusk in the early 2000s. The city looks calmer than it did decades earlier. Cafes glow softly. Traffic hums. Young people gather in squares with phones in hand, connected to worlds far beyond the island. On the surface, Sicily feels lighter, more open, more integrated into Europe and the wider world. And yet, beneath this openness, familiar patterns persist. The Mafia understands something essential about modern power. It no longer needs to announce itself to be effective. In fact, visibility is now a liability. In an era of cameras, audits, and digital trails, survival depends on blending in completely. Power without a face becomes the goal. Gone are the days when influence is asserted through obvious intimidation or public presence. The modern mafia prefers contracts to threats, influence to fear, access to dominance. It inserts itself into systems that already exist rather than imposing itself from outside. This is a quieter, more administrative form of control. Sectors like waste management, transportation, logistics, food distribution, renewable energy, and public services become especially attractive. These industries involve complex contracts, layered subcontracting, and steady public funding. Oversight exists, but it is often fragmented and bureaucratic. The mafia thrives in complexity. Money moves through legitimate accounts. Businesses file proper paperwork. Taxes are paid. On the surface, everything appears normal. But influence shapes outcomes subtly. Certain bids succeed. Certain competitors withdraw. Certain projects encounter unexplained obstacles. Nothing dramatic happens. And that is the point. This transformation changes how the mafia relates to violence. Violence does not disappear, but it becomes rare and targeted. It is used internally to enforce discipline or externally only when absolutely necessary. Public acts of terror are avoided at all costs. The lesson of the 1990s remains clear. Loud violence invites unified resistance. Inside Palermo and other urban centers, the mafia becomes less visible to ordinary people. Many young Sicilians grow up experiencing it not as a daily presence, but as something discussed in history classes, documentaries, or court proceedings. This distance matters. It weakens the mafia's cultural hold. The old narratives of inevitability lose power. The idea that this is just how things are no longer resonates as strongly with a generation raised in a more connected, outward-looking world. And yet, the system persists. The mafia adapts by embedding itself in economic necessity rather than social authority. It provides jobs, financing, and stability in places where the state or private sector struggles to deliver consistently. For some, this creates moral ambiguity rather than fear. People may not admire the mafia, but they may rely on its efficiency. This is one of the most challenging aspects of the modern era. The mafia does not need to be loved to survive. It only needs to remain useful in gaps where formal systems fall short. At the same time, the state continues to evolve. Financial tracking improves. Anti-money laundering regulations tighten. Digital records create trails that did not exist before. Prosecutors increasingly focus on following money rather than chasing individuals. Asset seizures become more strategic. The contest shifts from territory to transactions. The mafia responds by diversifying further. It uses intermediaries. It invests across regions and even countries. It avoids concentrating too much influence in any one place. Fragmentation, once a weakness, becomes a shield. No single group is large enough to attract overwhelming attention. This creates a paradox. The mafia is weaker than it once was in terms of centralized power and social dominance. But it is harder to eradicate completely because it no longer relies on a single structure that can be dismantled. it becomes a moving target. For Sicilian society, this creates a different challenge than the one faced by earlier generations. The enemy is no longer a visible force to confront openly. It is an embedded pattern to be resisted consistently. Civic resistance adapts as well. Grassroots organizations promote transparency in local government. Journalists collaborate across borders to investigate financial crimes. Schools emphasize civic responsibility and historical memory. Confiscated mafia assets continue to be repurposed for social good. These efforts are not dramatic. They do not make headlines daily. But they accumulate quietly, much like the systems they oppose. The mafia notices. It becomes more cautious about political involvement. It avoids overt manipulation. It prefers low-risk, long-term influence over short-term gain. It understands that public sentiment has shifted, and that legitimacy, even informal legitimacy, is harder to claim. This leads to a strange kind of standoff. The mafia does not disappear, but it no longer defines Sicilian life in the way it once did. It exists alongside a society that is more aware, more critical, and less willing to romanticize its presence. Fear gives way to vigilance. For many older Sicilians, this change is bittersweet. They remember times when the mafia was omnipresent and terrifying. For younger generations, it is something abstract, discussed rather than endured. This generational divide shapes the future. The mafia's greatest challenge in the modern era is not law enforcement alone. It is irrelevance. A system built on filling gaps struggles when those gaps narrow. When people have alternatives. When transparency becomes expectation rather than exception. And yet, history cautions against complacency. The mafia has survived empires, regimes, wars, and revolutions. It thrives in uncertainty. Economic crises, political instability, and social fragmentation remain its natural habitat. The modern world produces these conditions regularly. As we rest here, imagine the city lights reflecting on polished stone. A sense of normalcy, of progress, of quiet confidence. And beneath it, the faint awareness that systems do not vanish simply because they are no longer seen. Power without a face is difficult to confront, but not impossible. The story of the mafia in this era is not one of dominance, but of adaptation. Not of spectacle, but of persistence. It is quieter than before, but it remains attentive, watching for moments when the old logic might once again feel useful. In the stillness of this moment, understand this. The absence of noise does not mean the absence of struggle. It means the struggle has moved into places that require patience to observe. In the next part, we will look outward, beyond Sicily, to see how this transformed mafia fits into a globalized world, and how its legacy continues to shape organized crime far beyond the island that first gave it form. Part 13, Beyond the Island, the old logic travels. As we drift onward, the horizon widens. Sicily no longer feels like the center of the story, even though it remains the heart from which everything once spread. The world has grown smaller, faster, more entangled. Goods cross borders in hours. Money moves in seconds. Information leaves trails, but those trails are vast, layered, and difficult to follow. In this world, the mafia does not need to conquer new territory. It needs only to understand how systems connect. I want you to imagine a port at night. Containers stacked high, each marked with codes and destinations. Cranes move with slow precision. Paperwork is filed digitally, reviewed by algorithms, approved by offices far away. Everything looks orderly, regulated, modern. This is where the old logic finds new room. The Mafia's historic strength was never brute force alone. It was coordination. Knowing who to call. Knowing which delays mattered and which could be ignored. Knowing how to make complicated systems feel effortless for those on the inside and frustrating for those on the outside. Globalization rewards exactly this kind of knowledge. As international trade expands, supply chains become intricate and opaque. Responsibility is distributed across companies, subcontractors, and jurisdictions. Oversight exists, but it is fragmented by design. No single authority sees the whole picture. The Mafia understands fragmentation instinctively. Rather than controlling an entire route or market, it positions itself at key junctions. Transportation hubs. Warehousing. Customs brokerage. Waste disposal linked to industrial production. Each point offers leverage without requiring visibility. Influence becomes modular. This modularity allows the Mafia to operate beyond Sicily without announcing itself. It does not need to export identity or culture. It exports method. The quiet manipulation of contracts. The strategic use of intermediaries. The exploitation of regulatory blind spots. In this way, the Mafia's presence becomes less geographical and more functional. Across Europe, North America, and beyond, similar patterns emerge. Organized crime groups cooperate not as unified empires, but as overlapping networks. They share routes, services, and expertise when interests align, and disengage when they do not. The Mafia becomes one node among many. This does not mean it loses significance. It means it adapts to a world where dominance is less useful than interoperability. Being able to work with others quietly is more valuable than imposing control loudly. Money laundering evolves alongside these changes. Gone are the days when cash alone defined criminal wealth. Today's profits move through shell companies, investment vehicles, real estate, and legitimate businesses that span multiple jurisdictions. Financial instruments grow complex enough to obscure origin without appearing suspicious. The Mafia invests not just in secrecy, but in plausibility. A business succeeds because it fills a real need. A contract is awarded because it meets formal criteria. A company grows because it operates efficiently. Influence shapes outcomes at the margins, just enough to tilt results consistently over time. Nothing looks illegal in isolation. This creates a challenge for enforcement that mirrors the challenge of the past, but at a different scale. Investigators are no longer tracking meetings in back rooms. They are tracing spreadsheets across borders, emails, corporate registries, bank transfers that pass through multiple countries in seconds. The work is slow, technical, and rarely dramatic. Back in Palermo, the global and the local intersect quietly. Young professionals work in offices tied to European markets. Tourists fill historic streets. The city projects an image of renewal and cultural pride. And yet, some of the same names still appear, faintly, in certain contexts. In ownership records. In subcontracting chains. In disputes resolved without explanation. The presence is subtle, but persistent. This persistence is not accidental. The Mafia understands that globalization does not eliminate inequality. It redistributes it. New forms of precarity emerge. Migrant labor. Informal economies. Regions left behind by rapid change. Wherever systems move faster than protections, gaps open. The Mafia watches for these gaps. It positions itself not as an enemy of modernity, but as an operator within it. It offers efficiency where bureaucracy slows. It offers certainty where markets fluctuate. This does not require intimidation. It requires timing. The organization's internal culture shifts accordingly. Traditional markers of status matter less than competence. Understanding finance, logistics, and law becomes as important as enforcing loyalty. Younger members are valued for technical skills rather than physical presence. This is a quiet transformation, but a significant one. The idea of Cosa Nostra as a rigid hierarchy gives way to something more fluid. Decision-making remains centralized in principle, but execution is decentralized in practice. This reduces risk and increases adaptability. If one branch fails, others continue. For societies trying to confront this reality, the challenge is nuanced. There is no single leader to arrest. No single headquarters to raid. No single crime to point to that explains the whole. Instead, resistance requires coordination that mirrors the system it opposes. International cooperation. Data sharing. Long-term investigations. Cultural awareness. Patience. In some ways, the struggle returns to where it began. Not to gunfire or spectacle, but to endurance. For citizens, the question becomes more personal. How do you resist something that rarely announces itself? How do you maintain vigilance without paranoia? How do you build systems resilient enough that informal power loses its appeal? These are not questions with quick answers. What is clear is that the Mafia's global presence no longer resembles the romanticized or feared image of the past. It does not dominate neighborhoods openly. It does not seek loyalty through identity. It seeks advantage through systems. This makes it less visible, but also less rooted. The more the Mafia operates globally, the more it depends on conditions it does not fully control. Markets shift. Regulations change. Technology evolves. Public awareness grows. The very complexity it relies on can turn against it. As we rest here, imagine a map without borders. Lines of trade crossing oceans. Data flowing invisibly. Decisions made in offices far from where consequences are felt. In this world, the Mafia is neither gone nor triumphant. It is adaptive, cautious, and constrained by the same forces that enable it. The island that once shaped everything is now one influence among many. Sicily remains a reference point, a memory, a source of identity. But the future is negotiated elsewhere, in systems that reward subtlety over strength. This is not the end of the story. It is a widening of it. In the stillness of this moment, understand that power has changed form, but not purpose. It still seeks advantage. It still fills gaps. It still waits patiently for moments of uncertainty. In the next part, we will turn inward again, looking at how memory, culture, and storytelling shape the Mafia's legacy, and how a society learns to live with a past that refuses to stay buried. Part 14, Memory as Resistance. As we turn inward again, the noise of ports and contracts fades, and something quieter takes its place. There is a moment after long conflict when a society begins to ask a different kind of question. not only how something survived, but how it should be remembered. For Sicily, and for Italy more broadly, the question of the mafia is no longer only legal or political. It becomes cultural, emotional, generational. I want you to imagine a small square at dusk. The stone is worn smooth. A mural catches the last light of the day. Names are painted carefully, not in grand letters, but in a style meant to be read slowly. People pass by without stopping, but they glance, and that glance matters. Memory has become part of daily life. For decades, silence served as protection. Now, memory serves a different function. It interrupts forgetting. It prevents the old logic from reasserting itself quietly. It reminds people that what once felt inevitable was, in fact, constructed. This shift does not happen all at once. It unfolds in classrooms, kitchens, and conversations that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. In schools across Sicily, lessons include discussions of organized crime not as folklore or sensationalism, but as civic reality. Students learn how systems form, how power embeds itself, and how institutions respond. They learn names, dates, and consequences. They learn that resistance is not only dramatic, but sustained. This matters deeply. The mafia relied for so long on the idea that it was part of the natural order, that it existed beyond choice. Education challenges this assumption quietly but effectively. It reframes the mafia as a human system, shaped by decisions and therefore vulnerable to different ones. Cultural expression follows. Films, books, theater, and journalism revisit the past with a new tone. The focus shifts from fascination to examination. Stories center on impact rather than myth, on ordinary lives affected rather than powerful figures celebrated. This is not censorship. It is recalibration. In cities like Palermo, public spaces reflect this change. Former mafia properties, confiscated by the state, are repurposed for social use. A house once associated with fear becomes a community center. Land once controlled through intimidation becomes a cooperative farm. These transformations are symbolic, but they are also practical. They demonstrate that power can be reversed, that what was taken can be returned. That memory is not only about mourning, but about reallocation. The mafia understands the danger of this kind of memory. Violence can be countered with force. Legal pressure can be navigated. But cultural shifts are harder to confront. They operate below the surface, shaping values rather than transactions. They influence how young people interpret authority, success, and belonging. When the mafia loses its cultural legitimacy, it loses something essential. This does not mean it disappears, but it becomes alien. It feels out of place rather than embedded. Its presence must be justified economically rather than accepted socially. For older generations, this transition is complex. Many lived through times when silence felt like survival, when speaking carried immediate risk. For them, the emphasis on memory can feel unsettling, even destabilizing. It asks them to revisit choices made under pressure, and to see them differently. This tension is handled gently in many communities. There is an understanding that judgment is less useful than context. That acknowledging fear is not the same as endorsing it. That survival strategies are not moral failures, but historical realities. This nuance allows memory to be inclusive rather than divisive. The Mafia's legacy, when examined honestly, is not a story of villains and heroes alone. It is a story of systems interacting with vulnerability, of institutions failing and being replaced informally, of people adapting to uncertainty in ways that later became entrenched. Remembering this complexity is itself a form of resistance. It prevents the narrative from flattening into something exploitable. It avoids the romanticism that once made the Mafia feel inevitable or even admirable. It keeps the focus on impact rather than mystique. Across Italy, and increasingly beyond it, this approach gains traction. Journalists collaborate across borders. Researchers analyze organized crime as a structural phenomenon rather than a cultural curiosity. Civic organizations share strategies for transparency, accountability, and community resilience. The Mafia becomes a case study rather than a legend. This reframing affects how law enforcement and policy are designed. Instead of relying solely on arrests and trials, attention turns to prevention, economic inclusion, institutional trust, administrative clarity. The idea is simple, but demanding. Reduce the gaps, and the informal power that fills them weakens. In everyday life, this means small changes. Clearer permitting processes, fairer access to credit, support for businesses that refuse informal protection, public recognition for ethical choices that once went unnoticed. These actions do not make headlines. They do not feel heroic, but they accumulate. The Mafia notices this accumulation. It understands that while it can adapt to enforcement, it struggles against normalization of transparency. When systems function reliably, its comparative advantage diminishes. This is why memory matters so much. It keeps the reason for these systems alive. It prevents fatigue from turning into forgetfulness. It ensures that progress is seen not as a gift, but as something earned through cost. In the evening light of Palermo's streets, you can feel this layered time. Old buildings carrying new meaning. Names once whispered now spoken openly. Children growing up with a vocabulary their grandparents did not have. This does not erase the past. It integrates it. For the Mafia, this integration is uncomfortable. It thrives on ambiguity, on half-known truths, on the space between what is said and what is meant. Memory reduces that space. The organization responds, as it always has, by becoming quieter, more technical, less cultural. It withdraws from identity and leans into utility. But utility is easier to replace than identity. As we pause here, let the square empty slowly. The mural remains. The names stay visible even as night deepens. They are not demands. They are reminders. Memory does not shout. It persists. In the stillness of this moment, understand that the most enduring resistance is often the least dramatic. It is the decision to remember accurately, to teach carefully, to build systems that do not require informal power to function. This does not guarantee victory. History rarely offers guarantees, but it shifts the terrain. In the next part, we will explore how this terrain shapes the future. How younger generations engage with a legacy they did not choose, and how the Mafia confronts a world where its old language of fear no longer resonates as it once did. Part 15, A Generation That Knows the Story. As we move softly onward, the sound of the past recedes just enough to make room for new voices. They do not speak loudly. They do not speak with certainty, but they speak from a different position than those who came before. This is the first generation in Sicily to grow up knowing the Mafia not as an unquestioned presence, but as a subject of study, debate, and public memory. That difference matters more than it might appear. I want you to imagine an evening in Palermo now. Young people gather in a square after class. Phones glow in their hands. Conversations drift easily between languages. Plans are made for travel, for work, for futures imagined far beyond the island's boundaries. The city feels lighter, more connected, more fluid than it once did. And yet, the story is still there. They know the names. They have walked past the murals. They have learned the history in school, not as rumor, but as record. They understand what silence once cost, and what speaking required. For them, the Mafia is not a shadow in the corner of daily life. It is a chapter that must be understood, but not inhabited. This shift creates a quiet tension. The Mafia has always relied on continuity, on the passing down of habits, loyalties, and assumptions from one generation to the next. When that chain weakens, something essential begins to fray. Young Sicilians are not naive about power. They understand corruption exists. They see how systems can still fail. But they are less willing to accept informal authority as inevitable. They expect explanations. They expect processes. They expect accountability, even when those expectations are not fully met. Expectation itself becomes disruptive. In universities, discussions of organized crime are analytical rather than fearful. Students examine how systems form, how money moves, how institutions respond. They compare Sicily's experience to others around the world. Latin America, Eastern Europe, financial centers far from the Mediterranean. The Mafia becomes contextualized. This does not strip it of danger, but it strips it of mystique. And mystique was always one of its most effective tools. The old narratives lose traction here. The idea of honor as justification. The notion of protection as benevolence. The claim that informal systems are more reliable than formal ones. These stories sound outdated to ears raised in a different informational environment. For many young people, the Mafia feels inefficient rather than powerful. They see opportunity in transparency, in entrepreneurship, in collaboration with broader markets. They understand that informal influence often limits growth rather than enabling it. It narrows horizons instead of expanding them. This creates friction. The Mafia, quieter and more administrative now, still seeks relevance. It adapts by positioning itself as a facilitator rather than a ruler, offering access to capital, smoothing bureaucratic obstacles, accelerating outcomes. But younger generations are more skeptical of shortcuts. They have seen where shortcuts lead. They know the long arc of consequence. They have learned that speed without accountability carries hidden costs. This does not mean they are immune to pressure. Economic precarity remains real. Jobs are scarce. Housing is expensive. The temptation to accept informal assistance still exists. But the calculus has changed. Accepting Mafia influence now feels like a compromise of identity rather than a necessity of survival. That distinction alters behavior in subtle ways. People hesitate longer. They ask more questions. They consult peers. They weigh reputational cost more heavily than before. These pauses matter. In the past, decisions were often made quickly under pressure. Now, deliberation becomes possible. Alternatives are visible. Support networks exist outside traditional structures. Civil society plays a role here. Organizations that promote ethical business practices, legal support, and community financing provide options that did not exist before. They do not eliminate risk, but they distribute it. They make resistance less isolating. The Mafia notices this diffusion. It responds not with force, but with patience. It waits for moments when optimism wanes. Economic downturns. Political instability. Fatigue. It understands that confidence can be temporary. But it also understands that cultural shifts are difficult to reverse once they take hold. In Palermo, this generational change is visible in small details. Cafes that host public discussions. Startups that prioritize transparency. Social enterprises that operate out of formerly confiscated properties. These spaces are not overtly political. They do not frame themselves as opposition. They simply exist differently. Normalcy becomes a form of resistance. For the Mafia, this is challenging territory. It thrives on ambiguity, on the space between official rule and lived reality. When that space narrows, its leverage diminishes. The organization adapts by becoming more distant, less local, more abstract. Influence shifts toward financial arrangements that feel removed from daily life. This reduces confrontation, but it also reduces connection. The Mafia becomes less visible, but also less embedded. This creates an unusual situation. The Mafia still exists, still operates, still adapts. But it no longer defines the emotional landscape of the island. It is one force among many, rather than the frame through which everything is interpreted. Fear gives way to assessment. This does not mean vigilance disappears. Young Sicilians are not complacent. They know that history does not move in straight lines. They understand that progress can reverse under pressure. But they also know that memory provides tools. They have seen how silence once functioned. They have seen how exposure changed outcomes. They have seen how institutions improved when challenged consistently rather than dramatically. This knowledge shapes how they engage with power. They are less impressed by authority without explanation, less tolerant of inevitability narratives, more willing to ask how things work and why they should work that way. For the Mafia, this questioning erodes the foundation of its legitimacy. Even quiet legitimacy requires acceptance. When acceptance fades, influence becomes harder to exercise without revealing itself. And revelation is what the modern Mafia seeks to avoid. As we rest here, imagine the city late at night. Laughter echoes briefly, then fades. A tram passes. Windows glow with ordinary life. The past is present, but it no longer dominates the air. This generation does not deny what came before. It carries it carefully, aware of both cost and consequence. But it refuses to inherit silence as a default. That refusal is gentle, persistent, and difficult to counter. In the stillness of this moment, understand that change does not always arrive through confrontation. Sometimes it arrives through normalization, through expectation, through the quiet confidence that things can and should function differently. The Mafia waits, as it always has. But the world it waits within has changed. In the next part, we will look toward the horizon again, examining the future pressures that may test this fragile balance, and asking what conditions might allow the old logic to return, or finally lose its hold. Part 16, the conditions that invite return. As we move gently forward, the future does not appear as a single path. It opens instead into many possibilities, each shaped by conditions rather than decisions alone. History has shown us something important. The Mafia does not create instability from nothing. It waits for it. It studies it. It learns the texture of uncertainty and recognizes when gaps widen enough to step into. Understanding the future, then, requires us to understand the conditions that have always given this system room to breathe. I want you to imagine a city at twilight under gathering clouds. The streets are familiar, but the mood has shifted. Shops close a little earlier. Conversations linger on prices, on jobs, on delays that feel harder to explain. Nothing has collapsed. But something feels thinner than before. This is how vulnerability begins. Economic pressure remains one of the most reliable invitations. When work becomes scarce, when credit tightens, when bureaucracy slows responses to urgent needs, informal systems regain appeal. They promise speed. They promise certainty. They promise solutions without forms or waiting rooms. In these moments, the Mafia does not need to persuade. It only needs to be present. The modern world produces these pressures regularly. Global markets fluctuate. Supply chains break. Inflation rises. Political transitions stall decision-making. None of this is unique to Sicily, but the island's history makes it especially sensitive to such shifts. The question is not whether pressure will return. It always does. The question is how societies respond when it does. Strong institutions matter here more than ideology. When systems function predictably, even if imperfectly, people tolerate delay. When they fail visibly or repeatedly, tolerance erodes quickly. The memory of alternative solutions resurfaces, not as nostalgia, but as practicality. This is the space the Mafia watches. It does not announce itself as an answer. It waits for frustration to ask the question first. Political instability also plays a role. Periods of rapid change, coalition breakdowns, or public distrust weaken oversight. Rules exist, but enforcement becomes uneven. Priorities shift. Accountability blurs. These moments create administrative fog. The Mafia understands fog. It thrives when responsibility is diffuse and consequences feel distant. When no one seems clearly in charge, informal authority regains usefulness. Not because it is just, but because it appears decisive. This decisiveness can feel reassuring in uncertain times. Yet the modern environment complicates this dynamic. Media attention is constant. Data trails persist. Civic awareness is higher than before. The Mafia cannot step into the open as it once did. Any return must be partial, indirect, and carefully managed. This constraint reshapes its strategy. Rather than offering broad protection, it targets specific vulnerabilities. A struggling business sector. A stalled public project. A labor dispute dragging on too long. The intervention is narrow, plausible, and easy to rationalize. People tell themselves it is temporary. This rationalization has always been powerful. It allows individuals to engage without believing they are reinforcing a larger system. Each choice feels isolated. Each compromise feels manageable. History tells us how these small choices accumulate. The difference now is awareness. In places like Palermo, many people recognize the pattern even as they feel its pull. They know how informal solutions grow into entrenched expectations. They have seen how speed gained today costs autonomy tomorrow. This knowledge does not eliminate risk, but it alters calculation. Civil society has learned to respond more quickly than before. When pressure rises, organizations mobilize to provide alternatives. Emergency credit programs, legal assistance, public advocacy, transparency campaigns. These responses are not always sufficient, but they disrupt inevitability. The Mafia notices these disruptions. It understands that timing matters more than force. It waits for moments when counter-responses are slow, fragmented, or exhausted. Fatigue remains one of its most reliable allies. Fatigue does not announce itself dramatically. It arrives as resignation, as the sense that vigilance requires too much energy, as the belief that one more compromise will not matter. This is why memory and education remain so central. They replenish attention. They remind people why vigilance exists in the first place. They frame resistance not as constant struggle, but as maintenance. Maintenance is less heroic, but more sustainable. Another condition to consider is technological change. New tools promise efficiency, but they also introduce complexity. Algorithms make decisions difficult to audit. Digital platforms scale faster than regulation. Financial innovations create instruments few fully understand. Complexity creates cover. The Mafia adapts by learning enough to operate within these systems without mastering them completely. It relies on specialists, consultants, intermediaries. This reduces risk while preserving influence. At the same time, technology empowers oversight. Data analysis exposes patterns invisible before. Whistleblowers can share information widely and quickly. Journalists collaborate across borders with unprecedented ease. The balance is delicate. Neither side holds a decisive advantage. Instead, the future becomes a contest of adaptability and endurance. Climate change adds another layer. Environmental stress affects agriculture, infrastructure, and migration. Displacement strains services. Emergency responses bypass normal procedures. Temporary measures become routine. Emergency logic favors speed over scrutiny. In these conditions, informal coordination can reappear as efficiency. The Mafia does not need to create crisis. It needs only to exploit the shortcuts crises justify. This is not speculation. It is pattern recognition. The Mafia has always positioned itself where formal systems bend under pressure. The modern world provides many such moments, even as it strengthens resistance in other ways. What prevents return is not the absence of risk, but the presence of choice. When people believe they have options, they tolerate inconvenience. When they feel trapped, they seek exits wherever they appear. The Mafia offers exits that feel personal rather than institutional. The task of the future, then, is not eradication alone. It is option creation. Accessible credit. Responsive governance. Clear communication. These are not abstract ideals. They are practical barriers against informal power. This reframes the question of prevention. Rather than asking how to fight the mafia directly, societies ask how to make it unnecessary. How to reduce the moments when its solutions feel attractive. How to shorten the distance between need and response. This approach is quieter than raids or trials. It lacks drama, but it has proven effective where sustained. The mafia understands this threat as clearly as any crackdown. It is why it watches public trust closely. Why it pays attention to policy failures. Why it waits for cynicism to rise. Cynicism is fertile ground. When people believe systems are inherently corrupt or indifferent, informal authority regains legitimacy. The mafia does not need to be trusted. It needs institutions to be distrusted. This is why transparency matters even when outcomes are imperfect. Knowing how decisions are made preserves faith even when decisions disappoint. As we rest here, imagine the future not as a single outcome, but as a field of pressures. Some tighten. Some loosen. Some interact in unexpected ways. The mafia stands within this field, attentive and patient, as it always has. But it is no longer alone. It faces a society more aware of its patterns, more capable of naming them, and more practiced at building alternatives. The balance remains fragile. History warns us against certainty. It also offers guidance. Systems endure not because they are strong, but because they adapt faster than their surroundings. When surroundings learn to adapt as well, endurance becomes harder. In the stillness of this moment, hold this thought. The future is not decided by confrontation alone. It is shaped by maintenance, by trust, by the everyday functioning of systems that leave less room for informal power to feel necessary. The mafia waits for cracks. Society works to seal them. In the next part, we will step back once more and reflect on the long arc of this story, asking what the history of the Italian Mafia ultimately teaches us about power, absence, and the human tendency to build systems in the spaces between rules. Part 17, What the Silence Was Trying to Solve. As we ease into this part of the story, the pace slows not because the journey is ending, but because reflection asks for stillness. When we step back far enough, the history of the Italian Mafia begins to look less like a single phenomenon and more like a response. Not a justification, not an excuse, but a response to something persistent and human. Absence. Delay. Uncertainty. The long spaces where authority did not arrive in time, or arrived speaking a language people did not recognize as their own. I want you to imagine the Sicilian countryside once more, not as it is now, but as it has been many times before. Fields stretching toward low hills. Stone paths worn smooth by generations of footsteps. The land feels patient, but people cannot afford to be. They must decide quickly how to protect what they have, how to resolve conflict, how to survive another season. This is where the story truly began. Long before the Mafia had a name, it existed as a set of answers to practical questions. Who enforces agreements when courts are distant? Who protects harvests when soldiers are elsewhere? Who settles disputes before they escalate into cycles of revenge? These questions did not disappear when the Mafia formed. They were absorbed. Over time, the answers hardened into systems. Informal solutions became formal expectations. What began as protection turned into control. What began as mediation turned into authority. Silence, once a courtesy, became an obligation. Understanding this arc matters, because it reframes the entire story. The Mafia did not arise from a love of violence or secrecy. It arose from the need to make life predictable in unpredictable conditions. The tragedy is not that people sought stability. The tragedy is that the structure built to provide it eventually demanded obedience rather than consent. This transformation happened slowly, almost invisibly. Each generation inherited habits without fully examining their origins. Each compromise felt reasonable in isolation. Over time, those compromises accumulated into something that felt immovable. By the time the Mafia was recognized as a criminal organization, it had already embedded itself into daily life. It had become part of how things worked rather than something chosen consciously. This is why confronting it proved so difficult. You cannot dismantle a system that many rely on without first offering something else in its place. You cannot remove informal authority without strengthening formal authority enough to feel reliable. You cannot ask people to speak if silence has kept them alive. These truths shaped every attempt to address the Mafia, whether successful or not. When the state arrived forcefully, as it did under fascism, it misunderstood this dynamic. It treated the Mafia as an enemy to crush rather than a function to replace. The result was repression without resolution. Silence retreated, but it did not dissolve. When exposure arrived later, through trials and testimony, it succeeded because it offered something different. Not just punishment, but structure. Not just condemnation, but clarity. The Mafia was named, mapped, and understood as a system rather than a myth. This understanding changed the conversation. It allowed society to ask not only how to fight the Mafia, but why it had been necessary in the first place. It invited examination of institutional gaps rather than moral shortcuts. This shift did not weaken the Mafia overnight, but it weakened the conditions that sustained it. Looking across the entire arc, a pattern becomes clear. Whenever authority was absent, delayed, or mistrusted, informal power grew. Whenever authority became present, responsive, and legible, informal power retreated. Not completely, not permanently, but noticeably. This pattern repeats across time and geography. The Italian Mafia is not unique in this regard. Similar systems emerge wherever law feels distant and needs feel immediate. What makes the Mafia distinctive is how long it endured, how deeply it embedded itself, and how carefully it adapted. It learned to read absence. It learned when to step forward and when to withdraw. It learned that silence could be as powerful as force. It learned that legitimacy does not require affection, only acceptance. These lessons made it resilient, but they also revealed its limits. The Mafia was strongest when it could present itself as necessary. It weakened when alternatives became visible and credible. It faltered when people believed that formal systems, however imperfect, were preferable to informal control. Belief, in this context, mattered as much as reality. This is why memory and education have become such powerful tools. They do not just recount events. They explain mechanisms. They show how systems form and why they persist. They help people recognize patterns before they become entrenched. Understanding replaces mystique. This does not mean fear disappears. Fear is rational when dealing with power that has proven its capacity for harm. But fear alone does not sustain a system forever. It requires reinforcement through habit, justification, and resignation. When resignation fades, systems wobble. The Mafia's modern form reflects this shift. It is quieter, more technical, less cultural. It operates where necessity can still be claimed. but it avoids spaces where legitimacy would be questioned openly. This is not weakness in the traditional sense. It is adaptation to a world where visibility is costly and justification is harder to maintain. Still, the fundamental logic remains unchanged. The Mafia watches for absence. It watches for moments when systems fail people long enough for frustration to outweigh caution. It watches for bureaucratic delays that feel indifferent rather than procedural. It watches for communities left behind by economic transitions. These moments create opportunity not because people desire control, but because they desire relief. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the entire history. The Mafia did not survive because people admired it. It survived because it solved problems faster than anyone else when no one else seemed willing or able to do so. Take away the problem, and the solution loses relevance. This is why the future of the Mafia is inseparable from the future of governance itself. Not in speeches or policies alone, but in everyday responsiveness. In whether people feel seen. In whether institutions feel accessible rather than abstract. The long arc bends not toward justice automatically, but toward functionality. When systems work, informal power fades into the background. When they falter, it returns quietly, offering shortcuts that feel personal and immediate. As we sit with this understanding, imagine the land again at dusk. The same hills. The same stone paths. The same enduring patience of the landscape. Human systems come and go. Needs remain. What changes is how those needs are met. The history of the Italian Mafia teaches us that power does not always announce itself as domination. Sometimes it announces itself as help, as efficiency, as familiarity. Recognizing this difference is essential. It also teaches us that dismantling such power requires more than confrontation. It requires replacement. It requires trust built slowly and maintained consistently. This is work without spectacle. It is easy to romanticize resistance. Harder to romanticize maintenance. And yet, maintenance is what prevents return. In the stillness of this moment, let the story settle into perspective. The Mafia was never inevitable. It was responsive. It adapted to gaps, delays, and silences. Where those conditions change, it struggles to remain relevant. This does not promise an end. History rarely ends cleanly. But it does suggest direction. As the night deepens, we prepare to move toward the close of this journey. In the next part, we will reflect one final time on continuity, asking what remains when systems built on absence begin to lose their hold, and what kind of quiet future might take their place. Part 18, when continuity softens. As we move into this part of the story, the night feels gentler, as though it has learned something from everything that came before. After centuries of adaptation, confrontation, retreat, and return, the Italian Mafia no longer stands as a singular presence looming over daily life. It exists, yes, but differently. Less solid. Less assured. More conditional. This change does not arrive through victory or defeat. It arrives through softening. I want you to imagine standing along the Sicilian coast at dusk. The sea is calm. The horizon is wide and unhurried. The land behind you carries layers of history, but the water ahead feels open, indifferent to what came before. This is the feeling of continuity losing its grip. For most of its history, the Mafia depended on continuity to survive. The passing down of silence. the inheritance of expectation, the quiet acceptance that certain things simply were. Continuity made power feel natural, even when it was constructed. What has changed is not the existence of continuity itself, but its authority. Younger generations still inherit stories, but they inherit them differently. Not as instructions, but as information. Not as warnings to obey, but as contexts to understand. This subtle shift weakens the automatic transfer of power. Continuity becomes optional. In everyday life, this is visible in small ways. A business owner pauses before accepting help that feels too informal. A family discusses history openly rather than behind closed doors. A local dispute goes through official channels even when that process is slower. These moments do not feel dramatic. They feel inconvenient, even frustrating. But they mark a change in instinct. The Mafia notices this change not through headlines, but through resistance that never fully materializes into confrontation. People do not challenge openly. They simply choose differently. Again and again. Quietly. This quiet refusal is difficult to counter. Historically, the Mafia could rely on a shared understanding that certain choices were safer than others. That going outside the informal system was risky. That silence protected everyone involved. Now, safety is negotiated differently. Formal systems, while imperfect, are more present than they once were. Digital access reduces distance. Public accountability, though uneven, is expected rather than exceptional. The state is no longer a distant abstraction for many people. It is flawed, but visible. Visibility changes calculation. The Mafia adapts by narrowing its scope further. It avoids everyday interactions where its presence might be noticed or questioned. It focuses on niches where complexity still obscures influence. It becomes selective to the point of fragility. Selective power endures, but it does not dominate. In cities like Palermo, this softening is felt as an emotional shift rather than a legal one. The city breathes differently than it did decades ago. Not because danger is gone, but because it no longer defines the atmosphere. People plan futures without factoring the Mafia into every decision. This absence of constant consideration is significant. It suggests that the Mafia no longer frames reality for most people. It is part of the environment, but not the lens through which everything is seen. That distinction matters more than numbers or arrests. Continuity, once the Mafia's greatest strength, becomes diluted by choice. Each generation decides how much of the past to carry forward. Memory remains, but obligation weakens. This does not eliminate risk. Systems built over centuries do not dissolve in a few decades. Influence lingers in places where attention is low and pressure is high. But lingering is not the same as ruling. The Mafia becomes reactive rather than directive. It responds to opportunities rather than shaping environments broadly. It waits rather than commands. It adjusts rather than imposes. This is a quieter existence, but also a constrained one. For society, this creates a new challenge. When power softens, it becomes harder to detect. There are no obvious villains, no clear confrontations. The temptation arises to believe the problem has been solved completely. History cautions against this belief. Softened power can harden again if conditions shift sharply. Economic collapse. Political upheaval. Widespread loss of trust. These forces can reactivate old instincts quickly. The difference now is preparation. People have language for what happens when informal power fills gaps. They have examples. They have memory. They have institutions that, while imperfect, know what to look for. This preparedness does not guarantee immunity, but it shortens response time. The Mafia's greatest advantage in the past was time. It moved slowly while others reacted slowly. Now, reaction is faster, more coordinated, and less dependent on individual courage. Courage still matters, but it is no longer the sole barrier. What replaces confrontation is normalization. The normalization of transparency. The normalization of asking questions. The normalization of expecting systems to work. Normalization is not exciting. It does not inspire legends. But it erodes the extraordinary status that once surrounded the Mafia. Without extraordinariness, fear loses its mystique. This erosion is visible in cultural tone. The Mafia is discussed without awe, without fascination, without excessive dramatization. It is treated as a historical and structural phenomenon, not as an identity. This framing strips power from symbolism. For decades, symbolism carried weight. Names, rituals, gestures. They signaled belonging and authority. As symbolism fades into analysis, its emotional grip loosens. The Mafia becomes explainable. Explainability does not destroy power outright, but it undermines reverence. And reverence was always more useful than fear. In the long view, this is how systems fade. Not through collapse, but through irrelevance. They persist in corners, adapting continuously, but they lose their ability to define the whole. They stop shaping identity. They stop organizing meaning. They become something to manage rather than something to live around. This is where Sicily finds itself now. Not free from history, but no longer governed by it. The land remains patient. The sea remains wide. Human systems continue to form, falter, and reform. The Mafia is one such system among many, no longer singular, no longer inevitable. As we rest here, imagine the coastline again. The sound of water against stone. The steady rhythm that outlasts empires and organizations alike. Continuity does not vanish. It softens. It becomes one influence among others rather than the dominant thread. It loses its urgency. Its claim weakens. In the stillness of this moment, understand that the end of a system rarely arrives as an ending. It arrives as a diminishing necessity. The Mafia persists where it can still answer needs faster than others. It retreats where it cannot. This balance shifts gradually, quietly, and unevenly. History has brought us here not through triumph, but through accumulation. Of awareness. Of alternatives. Of expectations. As the night deepens, only two parts remain. In the next, we will step even further back, viewing the Mafia not as an Italian story alone, but as a lesson about power that echoes far beyond Sicily. And then, at last, we will let the story rest. Part 19, a pattern larger than Sicily. As we arrive at this quiet stretch of the journey, the island itself begins to recede. Not disappear, but soften into the background, like a shoreline seen from far out at sea. Sicily remains the place where this story took shape, but the meaning of the story no longer belongs to Sicily alone. When we step back far enough, the Italian Mafia becomes less a singular phenomenon and more a pattern, one that repeats wherever certain conditions quietly align. I want you to imagine the world at night, seen from above. Cities glow like constellations. Ports pulse softly with movement. Borders exist on maps, but the rhythms of need, delay, and uncertainty feel remarkably similar everywhere. In this view, Sicily is not isolated. It is representative. The Mafia's long history teaches us something subtle but enduring. Informal power does not arise because people crave control. It arises because people crave reliability. When formal systems feel distant, inconsistent, or indifferent, alternatives emerge not as rebellion, but as adaptation. This pattern appears again and again, under different names, languages, and cultural forms. In one place, it looks like organized crime. In another, it looks like patronage networks. Elsewhere, it appears as gangs, militias, or informal brokers who know how things work. The details differ, but the logic remains familiar. Who can make something happen when the rules cannot? Who can resolve conflict faster than the courts? Who can offer certainty when institutions stall? These questions are universal. What made the Italian Mafia distinctive was not that it asked these questions, but how long and how effectively it answered them. It refined its responses across centuries. It learned how to survive empires, regimes, wars, and modernization. It learned when to be visible and when to disappear. But the pattern itself is older than the Mafia, and broader than Italy. Whenever we encounter informal systems that wield influence without accountability, we are seeing the same dynamic at work. Power flowing into gaps. Authority emerging from absence. Silence operating as a social tool rather than a personal choice. This is why the Mafia cannot be understood solely as a criminal organization. It is a case study in what happens when trust erodes and necessity remains. It shows how communities will build parallel systems rather than endure prolonged uncertainty. It reveals how those systems can harden over time, becoming resistant to the very change that once made them useful. This is not a moral judgment. It is an observation. The moral dimension enters later, when adaptation turns into exploitation, and when control replaces service. But the origin lies in unmet need, not malice. Understanding this distinction matters deeply, because it reshapes how societies respond. If informal power is treated only as an enemy to be crushed, it retreats temporarily and returns later, often stronger and more discreet. If it is treated as a symptom to be replaced, it weakens more sustainably. Replacement, however, is slow work. It requires institutions that respond quickly enough to feel relevant, processes that are transparent enough to feel fair, authorities that are present enough to feel human. These qualities do not arrive through declarations. They are built through repetition. This is where the Italian experience offers guidance. The periods when the Mafia weakened most significantly were not only those of repression, but those of replacement. When legal systems became more legible. When assets were confiscated and visibly returned to public use. When education reframed the past without mythologizing it. When alternatives existed, even imperfect ones. These moments did not eliminate the Mafia, but they reduced its necessity. This lesson travels. In regions far from the Mediterranean, policymakers, researchers, and activists study the Italian case not for its drama, but for its structure. They examine how informal systems embed, how they launder legitimacy, and how they adapt under pressure. The Mafia becomes a reference point rather than an exception. This reframing has consequences for how power is discussed globally. It encourages questions that move beyond crime statistics. Questions about administrative delay, about access to credit, about trust in public institutions, about how quickly grievances are addressed before informal solutions step in. It shifts focus from punishment to prevention. This does not mean enforcement is unimportant. It remains essential. But enforcement alone cannot erase systems that are meeting needs, however problematically. The Italian story shows that enforcement works best when paired with replacement. Where replacement fails, informal power persists quietly. The modern world complicates this further. Globalization accelerates both formal and informal systems. When legal markets move faster, illegal ones follow. When regulation tightens in one place, pressure shifts elsewhere. Informal networks learn to operate transnationally, fragmenting to avoid detection. The mafia adapted to this environment by becoming less centralized and more modular. Other groups follow similar paths. This makes the pattern harder to confront, but also less stable. Decentralized systems lack the cohesion of older hierarchies. They rely more heavily on trust between nodes, which is fragile. They are efficient, but brittle under sustained scrutiny. This brittleness creates opportunity. Where societies invest in transparency, coordination, and responsiveness, informal power struggles to maintain relevance. Where they do not, it fills the gap patiently. This brings us back, one final time, to Sicily. The island story matters not because it is unique, but because it is illustrative. It shows how long informal power can endure. It shows the cost of ignoring absence. It shows the difficulty of dismantling systems that feel familiar, even when they are harmful. It also shows that change is possible without erasure. The mafia did not vanish. But it no longer defines the island's identity. It no longer frames every decision. It no longer commands the silence it once did. This shift did not require perfection. It required persistence. For societies elsewhere, this is a hopeful lesson. The goal is not to eliminate every informal structure overnight. That is neither realistic nor necessary. The goal is to reduce their necessity by strengthening what surrounds them. When people believe that systems, though imperfect, are improving, they invest patience. When they believe systems are stagnant or indifferent, they seek alternatives. Belief, once again, matters. The mafia's long survival teaches us that power is rarely destroyed directly. It is outgrown. It becomes obsolete when it no longer offers the best answer to urgent questions. This is not a dramatic process. It does not unfold evenly. It requires maintenance more than momentum. As we sit here at the edge of the story, the night feels wide and quiet. The island is behind us, but its lessons remain close. Look at the horizon one more time. The glow of distant cities. The dark spaces between them. Power moves through those spaces whenever they widen enough to allow it. History reminds us that those spaces are not fixed. They expand and contract based on choices made quietly, daily, and often without recognition. The Italian Mafia emerged in space. It adapted in space. It persists where space remains. Understanding this does not guarantee prevention. But it offers clarity. And clarity is the beginning of resilience. In the final part, we will allow the story to settle fully, not by summarizing events, but by resting with what remains when the noise fades, and by offering the listener a gentle place to leave the past without forgetting it. Part 20. Letting the story rest. As we arrive at the final part of this long, winding journey, there is no need for urgency. Stories like this do not end in conclusions. They end in understanding. An understanding, when it comes gently, allows us to set things down without forgetting them. I want you to imagine Sicily once more, not as a place defined by conflict or shadow, but as it is most often experienced. Quiet streets at night. Windows glowing softly. The sound of distant water moving steadily against stone. Life continuing, not in defiance of history, but alongside it. The history of the Italian Mafia does not ask us to remember every name, every event, every turning point. It asks us to remember something subtler. How power forms when absence persists. How silence can feel protective before it becomes restrictive. How systems created to solve problems can, over time, become problems themselves. This is not a story of monsters. It is a story of human responses to uncertainty. For centuries, the Mafia existed because it fit its environment. It answered questions that were not being answered elsewhere. It filled spaces left open by distant authority, slow institutions, and uneven trust. It survived because it adapted, learned restraint, learned patience, and learned when to disappear. But what this story also shows is that no system, no matter how adaptive, is immune to change around it. The Mafia did not weaken because it was confronted once. It weakened because the conditions that sustained it slowly shifted. Education expanded. Institutions became more responsive. Memory replaced myth. Silence lost its protective power. Change did not come all at once. It arrived in fragments. A courtroom that refused to look away. A school lesson that explained rather than warned. A confiscated building turned into a public space. A generation that asked questions instead of inheriting assumptions. Each fragment felt small. Together, they reshaped the terrain. As background historian, walking with you through this story, what I have tried to do is slow it down enough for these patterns to become visible. To let the story breathe. To show that history is rarely a sequence of dramatic moments, but a long accumulation of ordinary decisions made under pressure. The Mafia thrived when those decisions felt unavoidable. It retreated when alternatives became imaginable. This does not mean the story is over. Systems built over centuries do not vanish cleanly. They linger. They adapt. They wait for moments when old logic might feel useful again. But waiting is not the same as ruling. In places like Palermo, the Mafia no longer defines the emotional weather of daily life. It does not shape every calculation, every conversation, every future imagined. It exists in the margins, watched more closely than before, constrained by a society that understands its own history better than it once did. That understanding is the quiet victory of this story. Not triumph. Not eradication. But awareness. Awareness changes how fear operates. It changes how choices are weighed. It turns silence from an instinct into a decision. And decisions, even small ones, are where history actually moves. As this series comes to rest, there is no final moral to draw, no single lesson to memorize. Instead, there is an invitation to notice patterns. Notice where power grows when systems fail to respond. Notice how patience can sustain control, but also how patience can sustain reform. Notice how memory, when held carefully, becomes a tool rather than a burden. And perhaps most importantly, notice that the spaces where informal power thrives are not fixed. They are shaped by responsiveness, by trust, and by whether people feel seen rather than managed. The Italian Mafia teaches us that absence creates authority just as surely as presence dismantles it. That silence can preserve life in one era and restrict it in another. That continuity, when unexamined, can feel natural even when it no longer serves. These are lessons that extend far beyond Sicily. As the night deepens now, there is nothing more that needs to be said. The story has unfolded slowly, deliberately, with room to rest between its moments. It does not demand vigilance in this final hour. Only reflection. Imagine the island at rest. The hills dark under moonlight. The sea steady and indifferent. The streets quiet, carrying layers of memory without being weighed down by them. History continues, but it does so softly. And you, listener, are free to let the details fade while the understanding remains. There is no need to hold on to every thread. The shape of the story is enough. Thank you for walking with me through this long, patient history. Thank you for listening without haste. You can leave the past where it belongs now, not forgotten, but gently set aside. The night is quiet. The story has been told. And you may rest. As we come to the end of tonight's story, there is no need to hold on tightly. History, when told slowly, is not meant to weigh on you. It is meant to pass through gently, leaving behind a sense of shape rather than detail. What we have walked through together is not a tale of constant noise or endless conflict, but a long rhythm of cause and response, presence and absence, silence and speech. The story of the Italian Mafia, when seen this way, becomes less frightening and more human. Not because of what it did, but because of what allowed it to exist. Gaps that stayed open too long. Needs that waited without answers. Habits that formed quietly and were passed down without being questioned. And just as quietly, those habits began to loosen. Across the years, across generations, something subtle changed. Memory replaced myth. Understanding replaced inevitability. The old shadows did not vanish all at once, but they softened as the light around them grew steadier. In places like Palermo, life now carries history without being defined by it. Streets remember what happened, but they no longer whisper it constantly. The past exists, acknowledged and understood, while the present moves forward at its own calm pace. This is often how history truly resolves. Not with endings, but with integration. As you rest now, let the details drift away. You do not need to remember dates, names, or events. What remains is simpler than that. A sense that power grows where attention fades. That silence can protect or confine depending on the moment. That systems endure not because they are inevitable, but because they are allowed to feel necessary. And most importantly, that necessity can change. If there is any comfort to take from this long journey, it is this. Nothing human-made is permanent. Not fear. Not authority. Not even systems that last centuries. They shift when conditions shift. They soften when alternatives appear. They fade when they are no longer needed to explain the world. Now, the night has done its work. You can let your thoughts slow. Let the images dissolve. Let the story settle into the background where it belongs. There is nothing left to analyze, nothing left to follow. Only quiet. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for listening patiently, without rushing, without asking the story to become louder than it needed to be. Wherever you are, you can rest now. The past has been spoken softly, and the night is free to carry you gently onward.